November 2nd, 1860. On a humid, overcast day in Noonan, Georgia, a child entered a world of immense privilege that sat unknowingly on the precipice of total annihilation. Jefferson Randolph Smith II was born into the upper crust of Coweta County society, the son of a respected lawyer and the grandson of a wealthy plantation owner. His first breaths filled lungs that would eventually shout carnival barks across the western frontier. But in the nursery of the Smith estate, the air smelled of lavender water and expensive tobacco. The house was a monument to the permanence of the Southern aristocracy, built with thick columns and floors polished by enslaved hands. Servants moved silently through the hallways, attending to the whims of the family, ensuring that the infant Jefferson and his siblings never felt the sting of a mosquito or the pang of hunger. His father, Jefferson Sr., walked the streets of Noonan with the confidence of a man who believed the law and the land were immutable forces bent to his will. The Smith family name commanded credit at every merchant stall and respect in every parlor, creating a bubble of security that felt impenetrable to the boy in his earliest years. The illusion of safety shattered with violent abruptness when the Civil War erupted, transforming the Smith plantation from a seat of power into a target. Jefferson was too young to understand the politics of secession, but he possessed eyes keen enough to record the physical dismantling of his universe. The men of the county, including his father, traded their tailored suits for gray wool and marched away, leaving the women and children to watch the slow encroachment of poverty. The blockade choked off the supply of luxury goods, then the basics, until the family ate cornmeal mush on silver platters that grew tarnished from neglect. As the war dragged on, the neatly manicured lawns of Noonan grew wild, and the paint on the grand houses began to peel under the relentless Georgia sun. The grand dinners ceased, replaced by anxious rationing and the terrified whispers of adults discussing the advancing Union Army. Jefferson watched his mother, Emily, age a decade in 4 years, her hands growing rough from work she had never been trained to do, her face setting into a permanent mask of exhaustion. When the conflict finally reached its bloody crescendo, the war did not just end, it crashed through the front door. The Union forces tearing through Georgia stripped the region of livestock, crops, and wealth. The Smith family watched as soldiers confiscated their horses and emptied their larder. The emancipation of the enslaved workforce left the fields fallow, the cotton unpicked and rotting on the stalk. The economic engine that had powered their existence seized and died overnight. Jefferson stood on the porch of a home that no longer belonged to a ruling class, looking out at a landscape of red clay scarred by wagon wheels and artillery. The return of his father brought no relief. The man who walked back up the driveway was not the confident attorney of 1860, but a broken veteran, hollowed out by defeat and carrying the invisible weight of a lost cause. The currency in his pockets was worthless paper, and the law practice he tried to resurrect found no paying clients in a town where everyone was destitute. The years of Reconstruction were a slow, grinding humiliation for the Smiths. Jefferson grew from a toddler into a boy amidst the wreckage, learning to read in a house where the roof leaked and the plaster crumbled. He saw his father beg for extensions on debts that could never be paid. He watched neighbors, once proud patriarchs, reduced to peddling heirlooms for bags of flour. The lesson was brutal and clear. Rules, laws, and social standing were fragile constructs that vanished when the money ran out. The boy began to roam the streets of Noonan, fighting with other children over scraps and perceived insults. He developed a quick tongue and a quicker temper, learning that in the absence of order, the loudest and most aggressive voice often controlled the room. He observed the carpetbaggers and the speculators who descended on the South. Men who grew rich not by planting or building, but by manipulating paper and exploiting desperation. These observations festered in his mind, sitting alongside the memory of his father's honest, failing efforts to rebuild a life through legitimate means. By 1876, the situation in Georgia had become untenable. The soil was exhausted, the social fabric was torn beyond repair, and the Smith family faced total insolvency. Jefferson Sr., desperate to salvage some future for his children, made the decision to abandon the only home they had ever known. They sold what little furniture and finery remained, packing the meager proceeds into trunks that seemed pitifully light compared to the heavy grandeur of their past. The journey to Texas was not a hopeful migration, it was a retreat. They traveled by rail and wagon, a grueling exodus that stripped away any lingering pretenses of gentility. The train cars were crowded, smelling of unwashed bodies and coal smoke. Jefferson, now 16, sat jammed against the window, watching the lush green forests of the South give way to the flat brown scrub of the West. The changing landscape mirrored the hardening of his own resolve. He saw the physical toll the journey took on his mother, whose health had been failing since the war. The dust of the road settled into her lungs, and her cough became a constant rhythmic soundtrack to their displacement. They arrived in Round Rock, Texas, a stark, violent contrast to the genteel decay of Noonan. Round Rock was a transit point for cattle drives, a town built of raw lumber and fueled by the erratic spending of cowboys and drifters. There were no columns here, no manicured gardens. The streets were churned mud mixed with manure, and the air hung heavy with the smell of wet cattle and cheap alcohol. The Smiths moved into a small, drafty frame house that shook whenever a thunderstorm rolled across the plains. Jefferson Sr. attempted to establish a law practice again, but the Texas frontier had little use for the nuanced legal arguments of a Georgia aristocrat. Disputes in Round Rock were settled with fists or pistols, and the law was often whatever the man with the badge said it was on that particular day. The family's poverty deepened. Jefferson saw his father humiliated by shopkeepers who refused him credit, forcing the older man to barter his services for chickens or firewood. The shame of it burned the teenager, igniting a cold fury directed at the concept of honest toil. The final blow to the family's cohesion came with the death of Emily Smith. Her constitution, weakened by the privations of the war and the grueling move, collapsed under the harsh Texas conditions. There was no money for a specialist doctor, no funds for a sanatorium. She died in the small back bedroom of the Round Rock house, the heat of the Texas summer making the air in the room stifling and heavy. Jefferson stood by the bedside, watching the light fade from the eyes of the woman who had once commanded servants and hosted balls. Her death was not noble. It was a grim biological cessation caused by a lack of resources. The grief that followed was submerged under the immediate necessity of paying for a pine box and a plot of hard, rocky earth. Standing at her grave, Jefferson looked at his father and saw a man destroyed by the rules he had followed. His father had played by the book, honored the law, and worked the land, and his reward was a dead wife and a destitute existence in a dust-choked town. After the funeral, the house in Round Rock became a mausoleum of silence and resentment. Jefferson ceased any pretense of interest in school or legitimate employment. He refused to take jobs mucking stables or stocking shelves, viewing such labor as a trap that had ensnared his father. Instead, he gravitated toward the saloons and the gambling halls that lined the main thoroughfare. He was too young to drink legally, but he was tall for his age and carried himself with an arrogance that discouraged questions. He spent hours watching the faro dealers and the poker players, studying not the cards but the hands that held them. He noticed how a slight bend of a corner could mark an ace, how a distraction from a confederate could allow a dealer to pull a card from the bottom of the deck. He saw that the men who made the most money were not the ones sweating in the sun or driving the cattle, but the ones who sat in the shade and manipulated the odds. He began to practice with a deck of cards in his room, his fingers learning the precise fluid movements required to make a card vanish and reappear. He sat on his bed, the springs creaking under his weight, dealing hands to imaginary opponents for hours until his thumbs were sore. He learned to false shuffle, keeping the order of the cards intact while appearing to mix them thoroughly. He learned to palm a card, holding it invisible against his palm while his hand looked relaxed and natural. These were not games to him. They were weapons. He tested his newfound skills on the local boys, challenging them to games of chance behind the schoolhouse or in the alleyways. He took their pennies and their pocket knives, feeling a surge of power with every victory. It was not the value of the winnings that intoxicated him, but the act of control. He was rewriting the rules of the engagement, ensuring that he could not lose. The tension between Jefferson and his father grew toxic. The elder Smith, clinging to his moral code, demanded that his son find a trade, apprenticing him to a local merchant. Jefferson lasted 3 days before walking out, leaving a crate of unstocked goods in the middle of the floor. When his father boxed beneath a loose floorboard, he studied the maps of the rail lines, tracing the routes that led to Fort Worth, to Dallas, to the places where the money flowed freely. He observed a traveling carnival that passed through town, watching the barkers mesmerize the crowd with fast talk and false promises. He saw how they used confusion and greed to separate the locals from their hard-earned cash. It was a revelation. The victims did not hand over their money because they were forced. They handed it over because they believed they could get something for nothing. Jefferson realized that greed was a lever he could pull to open any wallet. One afternoon, he engaged a cattle drover in a game of 3-card Monte on a crate outside a dry goods store. The drover, dusty from the trail and flush with pay, was confident he could track the Queen of Hearts. Jefferson moved the cards with a lazy, rhythmic cadence, letting the drover win the first 2 hands. He saw the greed light up in the man's eyes, saw him reach into his pocket to bet a week's wages on the 3rd turn. Jefferson's hand moved with a speed that the eye could not register, swapping the queen for a joker. The drover flipped the card, stared at the joker in disbelief, and then looked up at Jefferson. For a second, violence hung in the air. Jefferson did not flinch. He held the man's gaze, smiling a cold, thin smile. The drover, confused and ashamed of his own foolishness, spat in the dirt and walked away. Jefferson swept the coins into his pocket. He had stripped the man of his money and his dignity, and he had done it without firing a shot. The final break with his home happened on a Tuesday morning. His father found the deck of marked cards and the tin of coins. A confrontation ensued in the kitchen, voices raised, accusations of criminality and moral failure hurled against the peeling wallpaper. His father threatened to turn him over to the sheriff to teach him a lesson. Jefferson did not argue. He simply went to his room, packed a single leather satchel with his few clothes, his cards, and the money he had saved. He walked out past his father, who sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, weeping for the son he believed he had lost to the devil. Jefferson felt no sorrow, only a profound sense of release. He stepped off the porch and walked down the dirt road leading out of Round Rock, the Texas wind whipping his coat around his legs. He headed north toward the railhead. He did not look back at the house or the grave of his mother. His focus was entirely on the horizon and the opportunities that lay beyond it. He was 16 years old, armed with a quick mind, nimble fingers, and a heart that had been hardened by the ruins of Georgia and the graves of Texas. He was no longer the son of a lawyer or the scion of a plantation. He was a predator entering a vast ecosystem of prey. The boy who had watched his world collapse was gone. In his place was a young man who intended to build a new world, one rigged game at a time. The road to Fort Worth was long and dusty, but Jefferson walked it with a light step, ready to introduce the West to the man he was becoming. February 9th, 1877. The Texas sun hammered down on the packed earth of Main Street in Fort Worth, baking the horse manure into a fine, choking powder that coated the back of every throat in the district known universally as Hell's Half Acre. Jefferson Randolph Smith stood on the corner of 12th and Rusk, a slender figure amidst the chaotic procession of humanity that defined the wildest railhead in the West. The Acre was a festering sore of vice, a collection of ramshackle saloons, brothels, and gambling dens that operated 24 hours a day without pause or apology to the civilized world. Drovers fresh off the Chisholm Trail rode their horses directly onto the boardwalks, firing pistols into the air and screaming for whiskey. Prostitutes leaned over the railings of second-story balconies, shouting prices to the men below, while pickpockets wove through the throng like vipers in tall grass. Jefferson breathed in the scent of stale beer, unwashed wool, and the metallic tang of dried blood, feeling the electric current of unchecked greed that pulsed through the town. He was barely 17, but his eyes held the cold, calculating stare of a man who had seen the machinery of the world stripped of its gears. For the first few months in Fort Worth, Jefferson operated on the periphery of the criminal ecosystem, scavenging for crumbs. He worked the short cons, the quick setups that required nothing more than 3 walnut shells and a dried pea. He set up his small folding table in the shadows of the cattle exchange, calling out to the passing cowboys with a rhythmic chant that promised easy money. He learned quickly that the shell game was a dangerous trade for a novice. The marks were often drunk, exhausted, and heavily armed, and when they realized the pea was never under the shell they had chosen, their first instinct was to reach for a Colt revolver. Jefferson had to be fast, not just with his hands but with his feet. He had to gauge the temper of a mark in seconds, deciding whether to let the man win a small pot to cool him down or to fold the table and vanish into an alleyway before the shooting started. He took his lumps during this apprenticeship. A burly teamster caught him palming the pea one afternoon and backhanded him across the face, splitting his lip and knocking him into the dust. Jefferson wiped the blood away, stared at the man's retreating back, and filed the pain away as tuition. By the winter of 1878, Jefferson realized that the shell game was a dead end. It was too common, too synonymous with theft. Every sheriff in Texas arrested thimble riggers on sight, and the public was growing wise to the trick. The risk of being shot over a $5 bet was too high. He needed a method that looked like commerce, not gambling. He needed a hustle that offered a tangible product, something that gave the victim a physical object to hold, creating the illusion of a legitimate transaction. He spent weeks observing the street peddlers who sold patent medicines and household trinkets. These men operated in the open, unmolested by the law because they held vendor licenses. Jefferson studied their pitch, their ability to gather a crowd with nothing but a loud voice and a wooden crate. He saw how people lowered their defenses when they thought they were buying a cure or a tool rather than placing a bet. The idea formed in his mind slowly, piecing itself together from the fragments of his observations. A product everyone needed, a gamble disguised as a bonus, and a presentation that mesmerized the eye. He chose soap. It was innocuous, cheap, and universally recognized. He purchased a bulk supply of small white cakes of soap from a wholesaler, along with a ream of plain blue wrapping paper. In the privacy of his rented room at the commercial hotel, which smelled of mildew and lye, he began to practice the mechanics of his new invention. He took a crisp $100 bill, a fortune in those days, and wrapped it tightly around a bar of soap. He then wrapped the blue paper over the money and the soap, sealing the ends with wax so that the package looked identical to a regular bar. He repeated the process with $10 bills, $20 bills, and $50 bills. He practiced the crucial move for hours, the ability to appear to wrap money into a package while actually palming the bill and substituting a pre-wrapped bar that contained nothing but soap. He refined the sleight of hand until the switch was imperceptible, a fluid motion of the wrist that happened in the blink of an eye. The physical repetition was grueling, his fingers cramped and the paper cut his skin. But he did not stop until the motion was as natural as breathing. The debut of the prize soap racket occurred on a Tuesday in March 1879. Jefferson set up a collapsible tripod stand on a busy corner near the rail depot. He opened a battered leather suitcase, displaying piles of the blue-wrapped soap bars. He did not whisper or hide. He shouted. He pitched his voice to cut through the din of the street traffic, adopting the persona of a benevolent philanthropist. He told the gathering crowd that he was an advertising agent for a new soap manufacturer, sent to distribute samples and cash prizes to the good people of Fort Worth to build the brand's reputation. He held up a bar of soap and a $100 bill, showing them to the skeptics in the front row. With a flourish, he wrapped the money around the soap, covered it in blue paper, and tossed it into the pile of other packages in the suitcase. He did this again with a 20 and a 50, mixing the prize packages in with the regular ones. The visual confirmation of the money going into the pile was the key. The crowd saw the bills with their own eyes, cementing the belief that the cash was there for the taking. The hook was simple. Buy a bar of soap for $1 and you might find $100 inside. The crowd watched, intrigued, but hesitant. This was where the shills came in. Jefferson had recruited 2 reliable associates from the dives of the acre, men with nondescript faces who could blend into a mob. One of them, a man named Red Hall, stepped forward, acting the part of a curious bystander. He handed Jefferson a silver dollar, selected a bar from the pile, and tore open the paper. He held up a $20 bill, shouting in feigned amazement. The crowd surged forward. Another shill bought a bar and won $50. The psychological dam broke. The miners, cowboys, and clerks pressed in, waving their silver dollars, desperate to buy a chance at the easy money. Jefferson sold the soap as fast as he could hand it out. Every legitimate customer, without exception, tore open their package to find nothing but a 5-cent cake of soap. The genius of the scam lay in the confusion in the pacing. When a victim complained, Jefferson would point to the shills who were still standing nearby, counting their winnings. He would loudly congratulate the lucky ones and offer his condolences to the losers, reminding them that fortune favored the bold. If a man became aggressive, claiming he had been cheated, Jefferson's demeanor would shift instantly from carnival barker to menacing enforcer. He kept a weighted sap in his coat pocket and a revolver tucked in his waistband. On one occasion, a burly railroad brakeman realized the game was rigged and lunged across the tripod, grabbing Jefferson by the lapels. Jefferson did not panic. He drove his knee into the man's groin with sickening force, then brought the heavy brass base of a soap sample down on the man's ear. The brakeman collapsed, blood streaming down his neck and pooling in the dust. Jefferson straightened his coat, looked at the stunned crowd, and announced that he would not tolerate ungentlemanly conduct disrupting a legitimate business enterprise. The sheer audacity of the violence, combined with his unwavering confidence, cowed the onlookers. By 1880, the name Soapy Smith began to circulate through the underworld of the West. It was not a title of mockery, but one of professional recognition. He had elevated the street con to an art form. He refined his operation, hiring more shills and training them in complex signals. He taught them how to block the view of a skeptical lawman, how to start a cheering section to drown out a heckler, and how to create a rush where they would fight each other to buy the soap, inciting a panic of greed in the real marks. He moved beyond Fort Worth, taking his tripod and suitcase on the rails. He hit Dallas, Waco, and San Antonio, staying in a town only until the heat became too intense, then moving on to the next railhead. He learned to read the specific character of each town. In the cattle towns, he played the rough-and-tumble salesman. In the more civilized hubs, he adopted the air of a sophisticated promoter wearing tailored suits and a diamond stickpin. The physical toll of this life was significant. Jefferson was involved in dozens of fistfights on the dusty streets of Texas towns. His knuckles were permanently scarred from striking jawbones and teeth. He learned to fight dirty, to gouge eyes and stomp insteps because in a street brawl there was no prize for honor, only for survival. In 1881, outside a saloon in Abilene, a local deputy tried to confiscate his suitcase. The deputy was young and nervous, his hand hovering over his gun. Jefferson stared him down, speaking in a low, calm voice. He told the deputy that the suitcase contained personal property and that interfering with commerce was a violation of his rights. As he spoke, 3 of his crew silently moved into position behind the deputy. The lawman sensed the trap, looked at the hard faces surrounding him, and slowly backed away. Jefferson had learned that power was not just about violence. It was about the projection of force, the creation of a threat so palpable that the enemy surrendered before the first blow was struck. The soap racket was incredibly lucrative. On a good day, Jefferson could clear hundreds of dollars, an amount that took an honest man a year to earn. But the money was secondary to the control. He relished the sight of the crowd dancing to his tune. He experimented with his patter, testing different psychological triggers. He found that challenging the manhood of the men in the crowd was effective. "Are you going to let this opportunity pass you by like a coward?" he would shout. "Or are you a man who seizes his destiny?" He watched them bristle, their pride stinging, and then watched them hand over their money to prove they were not afraid. He was dissecting the human animal, finding the buttons that bypassed logic and activated pure, blind avarice. The soap was merely the vehicle. The real product was the hope of unearned wealth, a drug more potent than the whiskey served in the saloons behind him. In 1883, Jefferson faced his most dangerous challenge yet in the town of Temple, Texas. A local gang, resenting his intrusion into their territory, decided to make an example of him. They surrounded his stand in the town square, 6 men armed with clubs and knives. The crowd scattered, sensing blood. Jefferson stood alone by his tripod. He did not run. He reached into his suitcase not for soap, but for a pair of Colt revolvers he had begun keeping there for emergencies. He leveled the pistols at the leader of the gang, a scar-faced thug named Miller. Jefferson did not shout or threaten. He simply cocked the hammers, the metallic clicks echoing loudly in the silent square. He told Miller that he would kill him first, and then he would empty the rest of the cylinders into whoever was standing closest. The absolute certainty in his voice froze the gang. They were bullies looking for a beating, not men, prepared to die. Miller spat on the ground, muttered a curse, and signaled his men to retreat. Jefferson watched them go, then coolly returned his pistols to the case and resumed his pitch to the terrified bystanders who remained. "Now, as I was saying, gentlemen, the soap that cleans the body and lines the pocket." During this period, Smith also began to understand the importance of political connections. He saw that the truly successful criminals were the ones who paid the law rather than ran from it. In San Antonio, he struck his first major deal with a city marshal. He offered a percentage of his daily take in exchange for protection. The marshal accepted, and for the first time, Smith operated with a badge standing guard next to his tripod. It was a revelation. With the law on his side, he could operate with impunity. He could swindle the mayor's brother and have the man arrested for disturbing the peace if he complained. This evolution from street hustler to protected racketeer marked the end of his apprenticeship. He was no longer just a fast-talking kid, he was an organization. The gang grew in size and sophistication. He recruited men with specific talents. There was Texas Jack, a giant of a man whose job was solely intimidation. There was Doc Baggs, a smooth talker who could charm the watch off a banker's wrist. Smith demanded absolute loyalty. He established a code among his men. They never stole from each other, they always split the take fairly, and they never spoke to the police. Those who violated the code were beaten and exiled. Smith presided over this motley crew like a feudal lord, dispensing justice and rewards from the head of the table at the finest restaurants in whatever town they occupied. He developed a taste for fine clothes, wearing silk vests and custom-made boots, distancing himself visually from the dust and grime of his victims. One particular incident in the summer of 1884 solidified his legend. He was working a stand in a small mining camp near the New Mexico border. A prospector, a giant of a man with hands like shovels, lost $50 to the soap game. Enraged, the prospector pulled a knife and charged. Smith, who was in the middle of a pitch, didn't even drop the bar of soap he was holding. He sidestepped the charge, tripping the man, and as the prospector fell, Smith kicked the knife from his hand. He then reached down, helped the man to his feet, and handed him a $10 bill from his own pocket. "You have spirit, my friend," Smith declared to the crowd. "I like a man with spirit. Here is a refund for your trouble, but the soap is mine." The prospector, confused by the sudden shift from violence to charity, took the money and walked away. The crowd cheered. Smith had turned a potential murder into a piece of theater that only endeared him further to the mob. He understood that the crowd wanted to see a show, and he was the ultimate ringmaster. The constant travel, however, began to wear on him. The train rides were long and uncomfortable, the hotels often flea-bitten. He tired of the endless cycle of setting up, making a score, and fleeing before the town turned hostile. He looked at the map of the West and saw the dots of civilization growing larger. He wanted a kingdom, not a caravan. He heard stories of Denver, the Queen City of the Plains. It was described as a place where the silver flowed like water, where the politicians were for sale, and where a man with vision could build an empire. The report spoke of a city that was shedding its frontier skin but had not yet grown the restrictive armor of the East. It was the perfect hunting ground. As 1884 drew to a close, Jefferson Randolph Smith made the decision to leave Texas. He packed his tripod, his suitcase of soap, and his earnings, which were now substantial. He gathered his core crew, men who had bled for him and swindled for him, and told them they were moving north. They were leaving the small towns and the cattle trails for the big city. They boarded the train with the swagger of conquering heroes. Smith sat by the window, watching the Texas landscape roll by, a landscape he had mastered and milked dry. He touched the scar on his knuckle, a souvenir from a fight in Waco, and smiled. He was leaving the shell and the soap behind, or rather he was taking them with him to a place where they could serve as the foundation for something much larger. He was 24 years old, a veteran of 1,000 street battles, and he was ready to swallow Denver whole. The rhythm of the train wheels on the tracks sounded like applause, a rolling ovation for the king of the frontier con as he rode toward his destiny. The sun set over the plains, casting long shadows that seemed to point the way north, toward the mountains and the millions waiting to be taken. May 15th, 1888. The locomotive hissing steam onto the platform at Denver's Union Station carried more than just steel and coal. It carried the ambition of a man who had outgrown the dust of the open road. Jefferson Randolph Smith stepped onto the pavement of the mile-high city, his boots crunching on the gravel that separated the tracks from the chaotic bustle of 17th Street. Denver was a sensory assault, a sprawling urban organism fed by the silver veins of the Rockies and the unceasing flow of eastern capital. The air smelled of smelting smoke, unwashed horses, and the distinct sharp tang of ozone that preceded the afternoon mountain storms. Brick buildings rose 3 and 4 stories high, a testament to permanence that the wooden shanties of Texas could not match. Electric arc lamps sputtered on the corners, casting harsh bluish shadows over the carriages and the pedestrians who moved with the frantic energy of prospectors sensing gold. Smith adjusted his collar, scanned the crowd for the telltale signs of local law enforcement, and smiled. He did not see a threat. He saw a harvest waiting to be reaped. The transition from itinerant street hustler to sedentary crime boss began with a realization of geography and climate. The Denver weather was unpredictable, with sudden blizzards and biting winds that could clear a street corner in minutes, effectively shutting down the soap racket. Smith knew that to maximize his revenue, he needed a controlled environment, a place where the temperature, the lighting, and the exits were under his absolute command. He scouted the district, looking for a location that sat at the intersection of legitimate commerce and the red light district. He found it on the corner of 17th and Market Streets, a building with good bones and a heavy flow of foot traffic. He signed the lease with the confidence of a tycoon, paying the first month in cash derived from the pockets of Texans. He named his establishment the Tivoli Club, a moniker that suggested European sophistication and high-class leisure, a lure for the weary traveler seeking a touch of elegance in the rough West. The physical structure of the Tivoli was designed with the precision of a slaughterhouse chute. The ground floor was a legitimate saloon, polished and inviting. The bar was mahogany, the mirrors were imported plate glass, and the whiskey poured was of genuine quality. This was the Filter. It was the place where a mark could be brought to relax, to lower his guard with a friendly drink, and to be assessed by the sharp-eyed staff. But the real machinery of the operation lay up the staircase. The stairs were narrow and steep, a physical bottleneck that controlled the flow of traffic. At the bottom of the steps, Smith ordered a sign painted in elegant gold leaf lettering, "Caveat emptor." It was a Latin phrase meaning "let the buyer beware," a cynical legal defense planted in plain sight. If a man walked past that warning and lost his life savings, Smith could claim with a straight face that the customer had been fairly warned. It was a joke that only the wolf understood, while the sheep walked blindly past it. To operate the Tivoli without the constant interruption of police raids, Smith needed to purchase the local government. He did not approach this task with subtle hints or vague promises. He treated bribery as a standard business expense, no different than paying for ice or beer. He arranged a meeting with the key figures of the Denver Police Department in a private room at the Windsor Hotel. The air in the room was thick with cigar smoke and the tension of men waiting to see who would blink first. Smith laid out his terms clearly. He was not asking for permission to commit crimes. He was offering a subscription service for order. He would pay a fixed sum every week to the patrolmen on the beat, the captains of the precinct, and the detectives in the bureau. In exchange, the police would treat the Tivoli as sovereign territory. If a victim came running to the station claiming he had been robbed at Smith's club, the police were to treat the complaint as a civil dispute between gentlemen gamblers, or better yet, threaten to arrest the victim for illegal gambling. The deal was sealed with envelopes of cash, thick with small bills that left no paper trail. With the law neutralized, Smith assembled his staff. He recruited the elite of the Western confidence men, individuals who had graduated from petty theft to psychological warfare. He brought in men like Doc Baggs, a man with the demeanor of a university professor and the heart of a shark, to run the steerage operation. The steerer was the most critical component of the machine. These men prowled Union Station and the upscale hotels, looking for the specific profile of the ideal victim. A traveler, usually traveling alone, dressed in clothes that suggested wealth but a lack of urban sophistication. The bon steerer would strike up a conversation, perhaps feigning a shared hometown or a mutual acquaintance. They would offer to show the visitor the sights of Denver, eventually suggesting a quick drink at a respectable club they knew. The Mark would be led chatting and happy through the doors of the Tivoli, unaware that he had just walked into a trap that had been set before his train even arrived. Once inside the Tivoli, the Mark was guided upstairs to the gambling parlor. The room was appointed with green baize tables and comfortable chairs, quiet and serious. Here, the big mitt game was played. It was a variation of poker, but stripped of all chance. The dealer was an employee of Smith's, a mechanic who could manipulate the deck with invisible speed. The other players at the table were shills, members of the gang posing as fellow gamblers. They would invite the Mark to join a friendly game. At first, the Mark would be allowed to win. The dealer would deal him strong hands, 3, of a kind, a straight, and the shills would fold or bet poorly, feeding the victim's confidence. The pile of chips in front of the Mark would grow, and the adrenaline of winning would cloud his judgment. The atmosphere in the room was carefully calibrated to induce a trance of greed, with the clinking of chips and the murmur of low voices creating a hypnotic rhythm. Then came the send. The dealer would deal the Mark an incredible hand, perhaps 4 aces or a straight flush. The Mark, seeing the invincible cards, would bet everything he had on the table. The shills would raise him, pushing the pot to a massive sum. When the Mark ran out of cash, the game would pause. The kindly stranger who had brought him in would suggest that the Mark run to the bank or his hotel to get more money, assuring him that the game would wait. The Mark, terrified of losing the pot and convinced his hand was unbeatable, would rush out, retrieve his cash reserves, and return to shove it all into the center of the table. The call would be made. The dealer would turn over his own hand, revealing a royal flush or whatever specific combination was required to beat the Mark's cards. The victim would stare at the table, his mind reeling, unable to comprehend that his sure thing had just evaporated into thin air. The aftermath of the fleecing was handled with brutal efficiency. If the victim accepted his loss and left, fine. But many men, realizing they had been cheated, became violent or loud. Smith had a protocol for this. He or his brother Bascom Smith, who served as the bouncer and enforcer, would step in. They did not immediately resort to fists. Instead, they used a bogus policeman stratagem. One of the gang members, dressed in a stolen or replica police uniform, would burst into the room blowing a whistle. He would shout that the place was being raided for illegal gambling. The shills would scatter in a panic. The policeman would grab the victim, threatening to arrest him and drag him to jail, which would result in a public scandal and a telegram to the man's family or employer. Terrified of the disgrace, the victim would usually beg to be let go. The officer would begrudgingly agree to kick him out the back door, warning him never to return. The victim would flee into the alley, relieved to have escaped prison, often not realizing for hours or days that the raid was entirely theatrical. Smith's control over the Denver underworld extended beyond the walls of the Tivoli. He declared himself the regulator of all confidence games in the city. Any grifter operating in Denver had to report to Smith, pay a percentage of their take, and obey his rules. Independent operators who refused to pay the tax were dealt with severely. On a Tuesday night in 1887, a pair of card sharps from Chicago set up a game in a hotel room without Smith's permission. Smith sent 3 of his men armed with hickory clubs and brass knuckles to the hotel. They kicked the door in and beat the 2 men into unconsciousness, breaking fingers and ribs with methodical precision. They stripped the men of their money and their clothes, tossing them naked into the hallway. The message was clear. There was no free trade in crime in Denver. Every dollar stolen in the city had to tithe to Jefferson Smith. The violence was not random, it was administrative, a necessary enforcement of the monopoly he had constructed. The violence was not always delegated. Smith himself carried the threat of immediate harm. He walked the streets of Denver armed, usually with a revolver in a shoulder holster and a knife in his boot. One afternoon, a disgruntled former associate named Red decided to challenge Smith's authority in a saloon on Larimer Street. Red, drunk and loud, pulled a knife and lunged at Smith. Smith did not retreat. He sidestepped the thrust, grabbed the man's wrist, and twisted it until the bone snapped with a wet crack. He then drove his fist into the man's throat, collapsing his windpipe. As the man gasped for air on the sawdust floor, Smith stood over him, adjusting his cuffs, and ordered the bartender to drag the trash outside. The brutality was a necessary component of his brand. In a world of predators, he had to be the most dangerous creature in the jungle. This incident cemented his reputation not just as a mastermind, but as a combatant who could handle the wet work when the situation demanded it. By 1889, Smith's influence had seeped into the very machinery of city politics. He realized that the police were just employees. The real power lay with the politicians who appointed them. He began to involve himself in the local elections. The Tivoli became a hub for political operatives. Smith used his gang to swing votes. On election days, his men would travel from precinct to precinct, casting multiple ballots under different names. They would intimidate voters who were known to support reform candidates, standing outside polling places with axe handles, staring down anyone who looked like they might vote for a cleanup of the city. Smith provided the repeaters, the men who voted early and often, fueled by free whiskey and silver dollars, supplied by the Tivoli's coffers. In return for delivering the vote, the corrupt city administration gave Smith carte blanche. He was effectively immune to prosecution, a state-sponsored criminal operating in plain view. However, the brazen nature of Smith's empire began to draw unwanted attention. The newspapers, particularly the Rocky Mountain News, began to run editorials condemning the lawlessness on 17th Street. They published accounts of travelers who had lost their fortunes, detailing the specific mechanics of the Big Mitt and the soap swindles that Smith still ran occasionally for old times' sake. The reformers were gaining strength, fueled by a growing middle class that wanted Denver to be a respectable metropolis, not a gambler's den. Smith dismissed these moralists with contempt. He viewed them as hypocrites who were happy to take the tax revenue generated by the saloons while turning up their noses at the methods used to earn it. He publicly mocked the newspaper editors, once walking into the news office and offering to buy a full-page ad advertising reliable dice and marked cards. The conflict with the press escalated in 1890. A particularly scathing article named Smith directly as the king of the bunco men. Smith responded by confronting the editor in the street. He did not strike the man. Instead, he tipped his hat and smiled a smile that did not reach his eyes. He told the editor that ink was cheap, but blood was expensive, and it would be a shame if the latter was spilled over the former. The threat was understated but terrifying. The editor continued to publish, but he began carrying a pistol. Smith reveled in the notoriety. He began to cultivate a public persona of the gentleman bandit. He donated heavily to local charities, handing out turkeys to the poor on Thanksgiving and contributing to the construction of churches. This duality baffled his critics. How could a man who robbed the innocent with one hand feed the hungry with the other? For Smith, it was simple. He was the lord of the city, and a lord had an obligation to his serfs, even if he was the one shearing them. One notable incident in the winter of 1890 highlighted the absolute reach of his power. A wealthy cattle baron from Wyoming, a man named Henderson, lost $3,000 in a rigged poker game at the Tivoli. Henderson went straight to the chief of police, demanding Smith's arrest. The chief, who was on Smith's payroll, listened politely and then told Henderson that gambling was illegal in Denver and that by admitting to playing, Henderson was confessing to a crime. The chief threatened to arrest the cattleman unless he left town immediately on the next train. Henderson, red-faced and sputtering, was escorted to the depot by two officers who ensured he boarded the train. Smith watched from the shadows of the station platform, smoking a cigar, verifying that his purchase of the police force was yielding the expected dividends. It was a perfect closed loop of corruption where the victim was treated as the criminal, and the criminal was the protected class. As the years of the Tivoli regime wore on, the internal pressure on Smith began to mount. Managing a criminal empire required constant vigilance. He slept little, often staying awake until dawn, counting the take and planning the next day's operations. He drank heavily, consuming quart after quart of champagne and whiskey, though he possessed an uncanny ability to remain functional even when intoxicated. The trust he placed in his lieutenants was always conditional. He knew that in his line of work, ambition was a common trait, and any one of his men could decide to take the throne. He kept Bascom close, relying on familial blood as the only bond that could not be bought. He also began to suffer from the paranoia that accompanies absolute power. He saw potential betrayals in every whisper and every side glance. He installed peepholes in the walls of the Tivoli to spy on his own dealers, ensuring they were not skimming from the pot. In 1891, the atmosphere in Denver began to shift palpably. The reform movement was no longer just a nuisance. It was becoming a political tidal wave. A new governor was on the horizon, one who promised to scour the corruption from the state capital. The business leaders of Denver, who had once tolerated the vice district as a necessary evil for a boomtown, now saw it as a hindrance to attracting legitimate Eastern investment. They wanted the streets cleaned up. Smith sensed the change in the wind. The easy days of open bribery were drawing to a close. He knew he would have to fight to keep what he had built, or he would have to find a new frontier. But for now, he stood his ground. He expanded his operations, opening a cigar store that served as a front for a lottery scam. He tightened his grip on the police, increasing the bribes to ensure their loyalty held as the political heat turned up. The Tivoli Club remained the crown jewel of his existence. It was more than a gambling hall. It was a fortress. Smith spent his evenings holding court at a reserved table in the back, surrounded by his sycophants and his muscle. He wore diamond rings on his fingers and a diamond stud in his shirt front, glittering symbols of his success. He was 31 years old and arguably the most powerful man in the Denver underworld. He had defeated the street gangs, co-opted the police, and baffled the press. But he was a man built for war, not for peace. The stability of the Tivoli regime was boring him, and the looming threat of the reformers excited him. He craved the chaos of the fight. One late night in December of 1891, a rival grifter from Kansas City attempted to set up a gold brick scam, selling brass ingots painted gold without cutting Smith in. Smith did not send his men this time. He went himself. He walked into the rival's rented room, kicked the door off its hinges, and found the man polishing a brick. Smith pistol-whipped the man across the face, shattering his nose. He then picked up the heavy brass brick and threw it through the closed window, the glass shattering onto the street below. He grabbed the bleeding man by the collar and dragged him to the window, forcing him to look down at the shards. "The next time," Smith whispered, "you go through the glass with the brick." He left the man shivering in the cold winter air that poured into the room. It was a reminder to the city that the lion was not sleeping. He was just waiting for a reason to bite. As 1891 concluded, Jefferson Randolph Smith stood at the apex of his Denver career. He had turned a single street corner swindle into a syndicate. He had monetized human greed on an industrial scale. The Tivoli was pumping money, the police were guarding his doors, and the politicians were eating from his hand. Yet, beneath the surface, the tectonic plates of Colorado history were shifting. The silver that fueled the city was about to become the source of a new, wilder madness, and the reform movement was sharpening its knives. Smith stood on the balcony of the Tivoli, looking out over the city lights, unaware that the next chapter of his life would take him out of the luxury of the city and back into the raw, violent cradle of a mining camp. But for this moment in the cold air of the high plains, he was the untouchable king of the con, and the city of Denver was his personal bank vault, the combination to which only he possessed. February 2nd, 1892. The wind howled down the narrow throat of Willow Creek Canyon, carrying with it the biting chill of the Colorado high country and the scent of raw ambition. Jefferson Randolph Smith stood on the tailgate of a freight wagon, looking out over the chaotic sprawl of Creed. This was not a city in any civilized sense. It was a festering gash in the mountainside, a frantic accumulation of pine shacks, canvas tents, and desperate humanity jammed into a gorge where the sun barely touched the ground for more than a few hours a day. The discovery of rich silver deposits had turned this remote ravine into the epicenter of the mining world overnight. Thousands of men had flooded in, turning the pristine creek into an open sewer and the frozen mud into a thoroughfare of greed. Smith pulled his fur-lined coat tighter against the cold, his eyes scanning the frenetic activity not with the wonder of a tourist, but with the critical appraisal of a wolf surveying a pen of particularly fat sheep. Denver had become too hot, its reformers too loud, but Creed was a blank slate, a place where the only law was the speed of a draw and the weight of a gold sack. The geography of Creed was a natural trap. The canyon walls rose vertically on either side, forcing the entire town to squeeze into a single muddy artery known as Main Street. There were no side streets to escape to, no sprawling suburbs to hide in. Everything and everyone flowed through the central channel. Smith recognized immediately that this bottleneck was a strategic gift. If he could control Main Street, he could control the town. He stepped down from the wagon, his boots sinking into the muck that was a permanent feature of the camp. He was flanked by his most trusted lieutenants, men who had followed him from the comforts of the Tivoli Club to this frozen outpost. They carried crates not of mining equipment but of whiskey, gaming tables, and firearms. They were not here to dig into the rock. They were here to mine the miners. Smith wasted no time in establishing his headquarters. He leased a prime lot in the center of the business district, pushing aside a squatter who tried to argue prior claim with a terrifying calmness that ended the dispute before a weapon was drawn. Construction on the Orleans Club began immediately. Unlike the hastily thrown-together shanties that surrounded it, the Orleans was built to project permanence and power. Smith paid the carpenters triple wages to work through the night, illuminating the construction site with bonfires that cast long dancing shadows against the canyon walls. Within a week, the structure was complete. It featured a long bar of polished wood, imported expressly for Smith, and a gambling floor that rivaled anything in Denver. The chandeliers may have been hung from rough-hewn beams, but the crystal was real, and the light they cast drew the miners in from the dark, cold misery of the canyon like moths to a flame. To solidify his grip on the chaotic populace, Smith executed a masterstroke of personnel management. He sent a telegram to Denver summoning a man whose name was synonymous with Western law and violence: William Barclay "Bat" Masterson. Masterson was past his prime as a gunfighter, a man who had traded the dusty streets of Dodge City for the sports-writing desks of the city, but his reputation was still a potent currency. Smith offered him a position not just as a dealer but as the manager of the Denver Exchange, a gambling house operated by a Denver firm. When Masterson arrived, stepping off the train with his cane and his derby hat, a ripple of awe went through the camp. Smith knew that the miners would think twice about starting a brawl in a place run by a legend. It was a calculated piece of theater. Masterson was the billboard, but Smith was the owner of the show. With the Orleans Club open and Masterson standing guard at the Denver Exchange, Smith turned his attention to the governance of Creede. The town was unincorporated, lacking a mayor, a city council, or a police force. It was a vacuum of authority. Smith stepped into that void and declared himself the de facto ruler. He organized a council comprised entirely of his own confederates and business partners. He declared that he would oversee the peace and order of the camp. It was a protection racket writ large. The other saloon owners and gambling hall proprietors were given a stark choice. Join Smith's syndicate and pay a percentage of their profits for protection, or face the consequences. Those who hesitated found their supply lines cut, their windows smashed, or their customers harassed by Smith's toughs. One stubborn proprietor, a man named O'Kelly who ran a small tent saloon, refused to pay. 2 nights later, a fight broke out in his establishment, destroying his furniture and driving away his patrons. O'Kelly paid the fee the next morning. The daily reality of Creede under Smith's regime was a mix of organized theft and brutal efficiency. The shell games and the soap racket, which Smith had seemingly retired in Denver, made a triumphant return on the muddy corners of Main Street. Smith knew that the miners, flush with silver and starved for entertainment, were easy marks. He set up his old tripod, the cold mountain air invigorating him as he launched into his spiel. He sold the soap with the blue wrappers, the promises of $100 bills driving the crowd into a frenzy. It was almost nostalgic for him, a return to the purity of the hustle. But now, he did not have to run when the sheriff came because he was, for all intents and purposes, the sheriff. His men patrolled the streets, breaking up fights that did not involve their own interests and ignoring the ones that did. The violence in Creede was visceral and constant. The camp was populated by men who spent their days smashing rock with dynamite and sledgehammers. They did not settle disputes with harsh words. Knives and pistols were drawn over spilled drinks, card games, and women. Smith maintained his power by being the most dangerous entity in a dangerous place. He walked the street with an air of absolute invincibility, often unarmed, knowing that his retinue was watching from every doorway. However, he did not shy away from direct confrontation. When a drifter known as Texas pulled a gun in the Orleans and threatened to shoot a dealer, Smith was the one who walked up to him. He placed his hand over the cylinder of the man's revolver, looking him in the eye with a gaze so devoid of fear that the gunman froze. Smith quietly took the weapon, pistol-whipped the man across the jaw, and ordered him thrown into the creek. The icy water and the humiliation were far more effective than a bullet. By April of 1892, Smith's control was absolute. He had essentially unionized the crime in Creede. The bunco men, the pickpockets, and the prostitutes all operated under his umbrella. He implemented a system where victims who had been completely cleaned out, left without even the price of a meal, could appeal to him. Smith would magnanimously return 10% of their lost money, calling it going away money, and send them on their way. This twisted charity earned him a strange loyalty among the very people he fleeced. They saw him not as a thief, but as a fair-minded boss who understood the rules of the game. He donated heavily to the few civic causes that existed, giving money to bury the dead who piled up in the makeshift morgues, and contributing to the construction of a church. He famously stated that while he was a sinner, he saw no reason why the saints shouldn't have a roof over their heads. The environment of the canyon during the spring thaw became a nightmare of slush and filth. The thousands of boots and hooves churned the street into a quagmire that could swallow a man to his knees. The smell of unwashed bodies, rotting garbage, and horse manure was trapped by the canyon walls, creating a miasma that hung over the town like a shroud. Smith, fastidious about his appearance, navigated this filth with a surprising grace. He wore high leather boots and kept his suits immaculately brushed. He held court in the Orleans, sitting at a private table near the stove, drinking champagne while the world outside descended into mud-soaked madness. He watched the famous and the infamous pass through his doors. Bob Ford, the man who had assassinated Jesse James, ran a tent saloon nearby. Smith viewed Ford with contempt, seeing him as a cowardly backshooter who lacked the class to be a true professional. Ford was a nervous, paranoid wreck, while Smith was the picture of composed authority. When Ford was eventually killed by a shotgun blast in his own tent that June, Smith barely looked up from his cards, viewing it as the inevitable cleanup of a loose end. The height of Smith's power in Creede came in late May. A group of reform-minded citizens, tired of the rampant corruption, attempted to form a vigilance committee to drive the gamblers out. They held a secret meeting in the back of a hardware store, discussing plans to lynch the ringleaders of the criminal element. Smith's spies, who were everywhere, alerted him immediately. Smith did not wait for them to act. He declared martial law. He rallied his men, armed them with Winchesters, and marched down Main Street. He confronted the vigilantes not with violence, but with a display of overwhelming force. He told them that he was the only thing standing between order and total anarchy. He pointed out that his saloons and gambling halls were the economic engine of the town. Without him, the miners would riot. The vigilantes, looking at the grim faces of Smith's private army, disbanded without firing a shot. Smith had won the war for Creede without spilling a drop of blood, simply by proving he was the apex predator. However, the volatile nature of a boomtown meant that disaster was always one spark away. On June 5, 1892, a fire broke out in a saloon next to the Orleans. The flames, fed by the dry timber of the shacks and the canvas of the tents, roared through the canyon with terrifying speed. The wind whipped the fire into a frenzy, jumping from roof to roof. Smith stood in the street, organizing a bucket brigade, his face blackened by soot. He barked orders, directing men to tear down buildings in the path of the fire to create a fire break. For a few hours, the criminal boss was the hero of the camp, working shoulder to shoulder with the miners to save the town. Despite their efforts, a vast swath of Creede was incinerated. The Orleans Club was reduced to ashes. The morning after the fire, the canyon was a smoking ruin. The smell of charred wood and melted glass replaced the stench of mud. Many men looked at the devastation and packed their bags, deciding the boom was over. Smith did not mourn the loss of his property. He saw the fire not as a tragedy, but as a renovation. He set up a temporary bar on the scorched earth of his lot before the embers were even cold. He served whiskey to the men who were sifting through the rubble. He vowed to rebuild the Orleans bigger and better than before. His resilience became a rallying cry for the town. If Soapy Smith wasn't leaving, then the silver must still be there. The town rebuilt with a manic energy, and within a month the Orleans was open again, the paint fresh and the roulette wheels spinning. Yet the fire had marked a turning point. The chaotic, wild energy of the early boom was fading. The silver veins, while still rich, were becoming harder to access, requiring heavy industrial equipment rather than a pick and a shovel. The independent prospectors were being replaced by large mining corporations. These corporations brought their own lawyers, their own security, and a desire for stability that did not include a crime lord running the town. The respectable element was gaining a foothold. The trains were bringing in wives and children, schools were being built, and the demand for law and order was becoming deafening. Smith saw the writing on the wall. He knew that the era of the dictator of Creede was naturally concluding. He had squeezed the orange dry, and the rind was beginning to taste bitter. In the late summer of 1892, a courier arrived from Denver with a message. The political situation in the capital had shifted again. The reform governor was faltering, and Smith's old allies in the city hall were calling for his return. They needed his organizational skills, his muscle, and his money to fight a coming war against the state government. Smith read the letter in his office at the rebuilt Orleans. He looked out the window at the bustling street of Creed. He had conquered this canyon. He had turned a mud puddle into a personal bank. He had ruled as a king in a land of paupers, but the thrill was gone. The challenge was over. Denver, with its complex politics and higher stakes, was calling him home. He began the process of divestment. He sold his interest in the Orleans to his manager, collecting a massive lump sum in gold. He liquidated his other holdings, selling the leases on the smaller gambling dens to aspiring locals who had no idea the boom was about to bust. He paid off his men, telling them to pack their gear. They were moving out. The departure was as grand as the arrival. Smith chartered a private train car for himself and his inner circle. As the train pulled away from the depot, chugging slowly up the grade out of the canyon, Smith stood on the rear platform. He watched the smoke of Creed fade into the distance. He had left the town poorer than he found it, but he had left it with a legend. He took a sip of brandy, felt the rhythmic clack of the wheels, and turned his back on the mountains. The journey back to Denver was a transition between worlds. He was leaving the raw, physical violence of the frontier camp for the nuanced, strategic violence of the city. He checked the load in his revolver not because he expected trouble on the train, but because he knew what awaited him. The City Hall war was brewing. He was not returning as a penitent prodigal son. He was returning as a general arriving to take command of a siege. The silver dust of Creed was brushed from his coat, but the hardness of the canyon remained in his eyes. He had learned in the gorge that absolute authority was possible if one had the will to seize it. He intended to apply that lesson to the streets of Denver. The dictator of Creed was dead. Long live the colonel of the City Hall. April 18th, 1893. The Denver that Jefferson Randolph Smith returned to was a city balancing on the edge of a precipice, staring down into an economic abyss that threatened to swallow it whole. The panic of 1893 was beginning to gather with the force of a physical blow, shattering the silver market that served as the spine of the Colorado economy. The federal government would repeal the Sherman Silver Purchase Act later that year, ending the federal purchase of the very metal that had built the opera houses, the mansions on Capitol Hill, and the saloons of Larimer Street. Mines closed by the hundreds across the Rockies, sending waves of unemployed, desperate men cascading down into the city. They camped in the parks and huddled in the alleyways, their faces gaunt with hunger and their eyes burning with a dangerous resentment. Smith walked these darkened streets not with fear, but with the predator's understanding that desperation breeds opportunity. While honest businesses boarded up their windows and banks collapsed under runs, the vice districts thrived. A man with his last dollar was far more likely to gamble it on a miracle than to save it for bread. Smith reestablished his dominance over the local underworld with swift efficiency. He did not merely reopen the Tivoli, he fortified it. He sensed the shifting political winds that were far more dangerous than the economic depression. The new governor, Davis Waite, was a populist firebrand elected on a platform of radical reform. Waite was a man of fierce, uncompromising morality, known to his enemies as bloody bridles. Waite for his rhetorical willingness to wade through blood to achieve his vision of justice. Waite viewed the corruption of Denver not as a symptom of the frontier, but as a cancer to be excised. He targeted the nexus of Smith's power, the Fire and Police Board. This appointed body controlled the hiring and firing of every officer in the city, effectively deciding which crimes were punished and which were ignored. For years, the board had been the property of the machine, ensuring that Smith's bribes translated into immunity. Waite intended to fire the board members and replace them with moralists who would shut down the gambling dens and enforce the Sunday closing laws. The conflict simmered through the winter of 1893, a cold season of breadlines and political maneuvering. Smith positioned himself as the indispensable ally of the threatened incumbents. He met with the corrupt commissioners Orr and Martin in the back rooms of cigar shops and the private parlors of the Tivoli. He assured them that while the governor had the law on his side, the machine had the streets. Smith began to stockpile weapons, not just pistols, but Winchester rifles and crates of ammunition. He drilled his men, transforming his loose collection of shills and bouncers into a paramilitary unit. He knew that if Waite succeeded in seating a new board, the police force would be purged, and the protection that allowed the Tivoli to operate would vanish overnight. This was not just a political dispute. For Smith, it was an existential threat to his livelihood. The tension snapped in March of 1894. Governor Waite, frustrated by the legal stalling of the incumbents, issued an executive order removing the fire and police board members from office. Orr and Martin refused to leave. They barricaded themselves inside City Hall, a massive stone fortress located on the banks of Cherry Creek. They declared the governor's order illegal and announced that they would hold the building by force if necessary. It was an act of open insurrection. The governor responded by mobilizing the state militia. The Colorado National Guard was called to arms, and the Chaffee Light Artillery was ordered to prepare their cannons. The city of Denver suddenly found itself the stage for a civil war. On the morning of March 15, 1894, the call went out to the underworld. The commissioners inside City Hall needed men who knew how to shoot and who had no love for the governor. Jefferson Smith answered the call with the enthusiasm of a patriot defending his homeland. He marched his soap gang down 17th Street, a column of hard-faced men armed with shotguns and lever-action rifles. They carried themselves with the swagger of professional soldiers. When they arrived at City Hall, the commissioners welcomed them as saviors. Smith was immediately deputized and, in a moment of absurd theatricality that defined the era, was commissioned as a colonel in the defense force. He was no longer just a grifter. He was Colonel Smith, the military commander of the resistance. Smith took charge of the defenses with a tactical acumen that surprised the professional politicians. He ordered the lower windows boarded up and rifle pits constructed on the roof. He placed sharpshooters in the clock tower, giving them a commanding view of the surrounding streets. But his most terrifying contribution was the dynamite. He had his men carry crates of high explosives into the basement of City Hall. He rigged the charges to the foundational pillars, running the fuses up to the main floor. He announced to the terrified clerks and the nervous commissioners that he would not allow the governor to take the building. If the militia breached the doors, he would strike a match and blow City Hall, the invaders, and the defenders into the sky. It was a bluff of monumental proportions, or perhaps it was not a bluff at all. The glint in Smith's eye suggested he was perfectly willing to turn the seat of government into a crater rather than surrender. The atmosphere inside the besieged building was a surreal mixture of a frat house and a bunker. Smith opened the city's liquor lockers and whiskey flowed freely. The defenders, a motley crew of deputy sheriffs, gamblers, and Smith's own thugs, sat in the plush leather chairs of the council chambers, cleaning their rifles and drinking from crystal tumblers. Smith moved among them, calm and authoritative, checking their weapons and bolstering their courage. He wore a heavy overcoat and a wide-brimmed hat, looking every inch the field commander. He knew that many of these men were mercenaries who would flee at the first sign of real combat, so he stiffened their spines with alcohol and the promise of victory. He told them they were fighting for the freedom of Denver against a tyrant who wanted to impose his morality at the point of a bayonet. Outside, the situation was rapidly deteriorating. Governor Waite, enraged by the defiance, ordered the militia to converge on City Hall. The citizens of Denver, sensing the spectacle, poured into the streets. By noon, a crowd estimated at 20,000 people had gathered in the area. They climbed onto rooftops, hung out of windows, and pressed against the police lines. They brought picnic baskets and children, treating the looming slaughter as a public entertainment. The sheer density of the crowd became a tactical nightmare. If shooting started, the civilian casualties would be catastrophic. Smith watched the gathering mob from the upper windows, realizing that the human shield was his best defense. The militia would hesitate to fire into such a throng. The climax approached in the early afternoon. The rumble of iron wheels on cobblestones announced the arrival of the artillery. 2 Gatling guns were positioned at the intersection of 14th and Larimer, their multiple barrels pointing directly at the front doors of City Hall. Then came the cannons. The Chaffee light artillery unlimbered 2 Napoleon 12-pounder field guns, aiming them at the stone walls of the building. The soldiers loaded the cannons with canister shot, tins filled with metal balls designed to turn the guns into giant shotguns that would shred anything in their path. The crowd fell silent as the gunners stood by with their lanyards. Inside the hall, the mood shifted from drunken bravado to cold terror. The men knew that against artillery their Winchesters were useless. They looked to Smith. Smith did not flinch. He stood in the main lobby holding a rifle, his face a mask of grim determination. He ordered his men to hold their fire until he gave the signal. He knew that the first shot would unleash hell. He held the fuse to the dynamite in his mind, weighing the lives of everyone in the building against his own pride. The standoff stretched on for agonizing minutes. The militia commander waited for the order to fire. The governor, sitting in his office at the state capitol, held the telegraph key that would send the signal. The air was thick with the smell of horse sweat, coal smoke, and fear. The silence was so profound that the clicking of the telegraph machines could be heard through the open windows of the nearby news offices. At the final second, sanity prevailed. A group of concerned citizens and business leaders, horrified by the prospect of a massacre in the business district, petitioned the federal courts to intervene. A federal judge issued an emergency injunction ordering the militia to stand down and the governor to cease hostilities until the Supreme Court of Colorado could rule on the legality of the removals. The order was delivered to the militia commander just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains. The tension broke like a fever. The cannons were limbered up, the Gatling guns were wheeled away, and the soldiers marched back to their barracks. The crowd, perhaps disappointed at the lack of bloodshed, slowly dispersed. Inside City Hall, the relief was palpable. Men cheered and slapped Smith on the back. They had stared down the army and won. Smith, however, did not celebrate. He knew this was a temporary reprieve. He ordered the dynamite to remain in place and the guards to stay at their posts. The siege technically continued for several more weeks while the courts deliberated, but the threat of immediate violence had passed. During this time, Smith lived in the building, sleeping on a cot in the police chief's office. He was the undisputed master of the situation. Reporters were allowed in to interview him, and he gave quotes that framed him as a defender of the Constitution and a loyal servant of the city. He spun the narrative that he was protecting the rights of the police board against illegal executive overreach. When the Colorado Supreme Court finally ruled, the decision was a mixed bag. They upheld the governor's right to remove the board members, but they condemned his use of military force. The incumbents were ordered to vacate. The war was lost, legally speaking. But for Smith, it was a massive victory. He had demonstrated his power to the entire state. He had shown that he could mobilize an army, hold a government building, and force the state militia to back down. He walked out of City Hall not as a defeated criminal, but as a legend. He had stood toe-to-toe with the governor and blinked last. The aftermath of the City Hall war saw Smith's influence reach its zenith. The new police board, appointed by the governor, found it impossible to completely root out the corruption. The police force was still filled with men who owed their jobs to the machine, and they knew who the real power was. Smith returned to the Tivoli, which was now more popular than ever. Tourists came just to catch a glimpse of Colonel Smith, the man who had almost blown up Denver. He played the role to the hilt, greeting visitors with the graciousness of a retired war hero. He expanded his operations, feeling untouchable. He believed he had inoculated himself against the law. However, the war had changed the city. The sight of cannons in the street had shaken the citizens of Denver. The amusement they felt during the standoff turned to retrospection and anger. They realized how close their city had come to destruction because of the whims of gamblers and corrupt officials. The reform movement, which had been a political annoyance, began to transform into a moral crusade. The middle class, the church groups, and the business owners began to organize with a seriousness they had lacked before. They wanted the Soapy Smiths of the world gone. They wanted a city where the law was not a commodity to be bought and sold. Smith, blinded by his own success, failed to see the depth of this shift. He continued to operate with brazen arrogance. He pistol-whipped a man in the street for insulting him, confident that no judge would convict him. He was right. The judge dismissed the charges, but the public outcry was deafening. The newspapers, which had once treated him as a colorful local character, now painted him as a menace to society. The dictator of the underworld was becoming a liability even to the politicians he bribed. The City Hall War had proven that Smith was dangerous, not just to individuals, but to the stability of the state itself. In the late months of 1894, the newly appointed police board finally began to gain traction. They fired the captains who were most loyal to Smith. They began to raid the Tivoli, not for show, but with the intent to close it down. Smith fought back with lawyers and injunctions, but the tide was turning. The immunity he had purchased with the dynamite was expiring. He found himself spending more time in courtrooms than in his gambling hall. The cost of doing business was rising, and the profits were shrinking as the Depression dragged on. Smith began to look for new avenues. He traveled to Washington, D.C. and Mexico, scouting for opportunities, leaving his brother Bascom to manage the declining affairs in Denver. He sensed that his time in the mile-high city was limited. The City Hall War was his masterpiece, a moment where he had elevated a gangster's dispute into a constitutional crisis. But masterpieces are rarely repeated. He had played his highest card, and the deck was now empty. As 1894 came to a close, Jefferson Randolph Smith sat in his office at the Tivoli, looking at the commission paper that named him a colonel. It was framed on the wall, a testament to the strangest week in Denver's history. He lit a cigar and watched the smoke drift toward the ceiling. He was still the boss, still the man everyone feared, but the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to be growing longer. The city that he had defended with rifles and dynamite was beginning to reject him like a body rejecting a transplant. He was a creature of the chaos, and as order slowly returned to Denver, his habitat was shrinking. The colonel was about to become a fugitive once again. January 8th, 1895. The winter wind in Denver carried a chill that penetrated deeper than the bone. It struck at the very foundation of the criminal empire Jefferson Randolph Smith had spent a decade constructing. The political climate had shifted from a turbulent storm to a sustained, freezing drought for the underworld. The inauguration of Governor Albert McIntyre marked the end of the chaotic, exploitable era of the populists and the beginning of a disciplined, ruthless reform movement. McIntyre did not engage in the theatrical brinkmanship of his predecessor. Instead, he appointed a fire and police board composed of men who were immune to bribery and deaf to threats. These new commissioners issued a directive that was as simple as it was devastating. The gambling halls must close, the Sunday liquor laws must be enforced, and the vagrancy statutes must be applied to men without visible means of honest support. For Smith, who listed his profession as capitalist, but whose capital was entirely derived from illicit gaming, This was a declaration of war where the enemy held all the ammunition. The Tivoli Club, once a fortress of immunity, became a target. The police began to conduct raids with a frequency and intensity that made business impossible. In the past, a raid was a choreographed dance where a warning was sent in advance, the shutters were closed for an hour, and a nominal fine was paid the next morning. Now, the officers smashed the doors with sledgehammers without warning. They took axes to the expensive roulette wheels and the faro tables, splintering the mahogany and green baize into firewood. They dragged the patrons, prominent citizens and drifters alike, into the paddy wagons, ensuring that their names appeared in the morning papers. Smith stood in the wreckage of his saloon, watching the destruction of his property with a cold, impotent fury. He realized that the protection payments he had made for years were now worthless. The contract between the criminal and the state had been unilaterally canceled. Smith attempted to fight back using the legal system, hiring the most expensive defense attorneys in the city to file injunctions against the police harassment. He argued that the raids were unconstitutional violations of private property rights. For a few months, the legal maneuvering slowed the bleeding. He managed to keep the Tivoli open sporadically, operating in a twilight state of semi-legality. However, the cost of the litigation was astronomical. The lawyers demanded cash. The few remaining loyal police officers demanded higher bribes to offset the increased risk. About the revenue from the gaming tables had plummeted because customers were too terrified to enter the building. The vast fortune Smith had accumulated began to drain away, flowing into the pockets of attorneys and bondsmen. He was forced to dip into his reserves, selling off diamond rings and real estate holdings to keep the machine running. By the summer of 1895, the situation in Denver had become untenable. Smith needed a new strategy, a new venue where his particular set of skills was still valued. He turned his eyes south toward Mexico. He conceived a grandiose plan to offer his services to President Porfirio Diaz. Smith believed he could organize a foreign legion of American toughs, a private army that would serve the Mexican government in suppressing bandits and rebels in the remote provinces. It was a delusion of grandeur born of his experience in the City Hall War. He truly believed himself to be a military commander. He gathered a small retinue of his most loyal men and traveled to Mexico City. The journey was a stark contrast to his arrival in Denver a decade prior. There was no fanfare, no welcoming committee. They traveled as private citizens, sweating in the tropical heat, carrying their ambitions in dusty valises. The meeting with the Mexican officials was a humiliating failure. The Diaz regime was a sophisticated dictatorship that had no need for a band of American grifters to maintain order. They viewed Smith not as a colonel, but as a potential mercenary troublemaker. The officials listened politely to his proposal, drank his wine, and then firmly declined his offer. They suggested that Mr. Smith and his associates return to the United States before their presence became a diplomatic embarrassment. Smith walked out of the government palace into the blinding Mexican sun, the rejection stinging his pride. The dictator of Creed was of no use to the dictator of Mexico. The trip had been a costly error, consuming a significant portion of his remaining funds and yielding nothing but a sunburn and a bruised ego. Returning to Denver in late 1895, Smith found his position had deteriorated further. The police had successfully closed the Tivoli for good during his absence. The building stood boarded up, a silent monument to a dead era. Smith was now officially a vagrant in the eyes of the law. He moved his operations to smaller, temporary locations, renting rooms above cigar stores and in the back of sketchier saloons on Market Street. He was forced to return to the basics of the con: the shell game, the soap racket, and the short card games. It was a steep fall from the high-stakes poker of the Tivoli. He was hustling for silver dollars instead of gold eagles. The indignity of it gnawed at him. He was a king forced to beg for scraps in his own kingdom. The violence of his life lost its strategic veneer and became raw and reactive. In February of 1896, Smith was involved in a brutal altercation in a saloon on Larimer Street. A former associate, a man who had once taken orders from Smith, made a disparaging remark about Smith's fallen status. Smith did not signal his men to handle it. He picked up a heavy glass decanter and smashed it across the man's face. The glass shattered, opening deep lacerations on the man's cheek and forehead. Smith then kicked the fallen man in the ribs repeatedly until bystanders pulled him away. The police arrived and arrested Smith, dragging him to the city jail. He was booked not as a dignitary but as a common brawler. He spent the night in a cell that smelled of vomit and despair, listening to the drunks in the adjacent cages. When he was released the next morning on bail, he emerged into the harsh daylight looking older, his face lined with exhaustion and rage. Throughout 1896, Smith became a nomadic figure, drifting between the cities of the West, looking for a place to land. He traveled to Salt Lake City, to Houston, to St. Louis. In each city, he attempted to set up his old games, but the telegraph had made the world smaller. Police departments shared information, and the name Soapy Smith was on every watch list. He would set up a soap stand, work a crowd for a day or two, and then the local detectives would arrive telling him to move on or face the chain gang. The travel was grueling. He rode in second-class coaches, ate cheap food, and stayed in boarding houses that did not change their sheets. The sophisticated criminal mastermind was being ground down into a petty itinerant thief. In Houston, he attempted a gold brick swindle on a local cattleman. The setup was classic. Sell a brass ingot disguised as gold for a fraction of its value. Smith played the role of a mining engineer down on his luck. He met the mark in a hotel room, produced the brick, and allowed the man to test a small corner of it. A corner that was actually real gold plugged into the brass. The cattleman was hooked. But just as the money was about to change hands, the mark's son walked in. The son was younger, suspicious, and had read the warnings in the farm journals. He demanded to drill into the center of the brick. Smith tried to talk his way out of it, using his charm and bluster, but the spell was broken. The cattleman drew a pistol. Smith had to dive through the window onto a porch roof and scramble down a drain pipe to escape, leaving the brick and his dignity behind. He ran through the muddy streets of Houston, a fugitive over a few $1,000s, a sum he used to bet on a single turn of a card in Creed. By the spring of 1897, Smith was back in Colorado, lurking on the fringes of Denver. He was technically banned from the city, but he could not stay away. He missed the action, the altitude, the familiarity of the streets. He stayed with his brother Bascom, who was still managing to operate a small, clandestine lottery shop. They sat in the darkened back room, drinking whiskey and reminiscing about the glory days of the City Hall War. Smith was 36 years old, but he felt 50. His hands, once steady enough to palm a card invisible to the eye, had developed a slight tremor, not from age, but from the constant grinding stress of the hunted. He spoke of retirement, of buying a ranch in Mexico, but they both knew it was a lie. Smith needed the game. He needed the adrenaline of the swindle to feel alive. The turning point came in July of 1897. The newspapers, which for years had been filled with depressing reports of economic stagnation, suddenly screamed with a new electric headline: Gold. The steamship Portland had docked in Seattle, carrying more than a ton of gold from the Klondike region of the Yukon. The descriptions were feverish: nuggets the size of hen's eggs, stream beds paved with yellow dust, men becoming millionaires in a week. The Klondike Gold Rush had begun. Smith read the reports in a Denver coffee shop, his eyes scanning the text with the intensity of a starving man spotting a banquet. He saw the numbers: Tens of thousands of people rushing north. These were not seasoned miners. They were clerks, farmers, teachers, amateurs. They were the perfect marks. The realization hit him with the force of a revelation. This was not just a boom. It was a migration of the gullible. It was creed, but on a global scale. It was a place where the law was non-existent, the environment was hostile, and the people were desperate for supplies, guidance, and hope. Smith knew instantly that this was his resurrection. He did not care about digging for gold in the frozen ground. He intended to mine the miners. He returned to Bascom's shop and slapped the newspaper on the table. He told his brother to pack the gear. They were going to the Arctic. The preparation for the northern invasion was hasty but thorough. Smith reached out to the remnants of his old gang, the men who had not yet been imprisoned or killed. He recruited the Rev Bowers, a con man who posed as a minister, Slim Jim Foster, a card mechanic, and a handful of muscle who were tired of the Denver heat. He told them that the police in Denver had won, but it didn't matter because a new kingdom had opened up. He scraped together every dollar he could, find, borrowing from loan sharks and selling the last of his jewelry. This was a gamble of everything on a single throw. If he failed in the north, there would be no coming back. They left Denver in late August, taking the train to the West Coast. The journey was different this time. There was a frantic energy in the air. The trains were packed with men heading the same way, their faces alight with gold fever. Smith moved among them not as a predator yet, but as an observer. He listened to their conversations, learning their fears and their dreams. He learned that they were terrified of the Chilkoot Pass, of the Canadian Mounties, of the cold. He filed this information away. Fear was the currency he traded in, and these men were rich with it. Arriving in Seattle, Smith found a city in chaos. The docks were a madhouse of steamers, outfitters, and crowds. Prices for passage to Alaska were skyrocketing. Smith used his skills to secure tickets on a steamer, likely bribing a purser or swindling a scalper. As he stood on the deck of the ship, looking out at the gray waters of the Puget Sound, he felt the old confidence returning. The bitter failures of the last 3 years began to fade. The humiliation of the Mexican rejection, the jail cells in Denver, the drainpipe escape in Houston, they were just the prelude to this. He was heading to a land without a governor, without a police board, without a reform movement. The voyage north was rough. The ship pitched and rolled in the swells of the North Pacific. Many of the passengers were seasick, miserable, and questioning their decision. Smith moved through the steerage and the cabins, offering sips of brandy and words of encouragement. He started small games of cards, letting the men win, building relationships. He was already working, already identifying the ones who had money belts strapped under their shirts. He was building his network before they even touched land. He introduced himself not as a gambler, but as a facilitator, a man who knew the ways of the world and could help the greenhorns navigate the dangers ahead. By the time the steamer approached the Lynn Canal, Smith had a notebook filled with names and an understanding of the social hierarchy of the rush. He stared at the coastline of Alaska, a rugged wall of mountains rising out of the mist. It looked foreboding to most, but to Jefferson Randolph Smith it looked like a bank vault door waiting to be cracked. He adjusted his hat, checked the pistol in his pocket, and prepared to step onto the beach. The slow bleed was over. The transfusion of gold was about to begin. He was ready to bring the lessons of the shell, the soap, and the dynamite to the last frontier on Earth. The king of the con was back, and he was hungry. August 23rd, 1897. The steamship city of Mexico fought the violent gray chop of the Lynn Canal, its smokestack belching soot that mixed with the freezing drizzle of the Alaskan coast. Jefferson Randolph Smith stood at the railing, looking not at a city, but at a scene of biblical desperation. Skagway was not a settlement in the traditional sense. It was a panic etched into the mud. From the deck of the steamer, the town appeared as a chaotic smudge of white canvas tents and raw lumber jammed into a narrow valley floor, flanked by towering snow-capped peaks that seemed to lean in with crushing intent. The tide was out, exposing a mile-long stretch of gray, sucking muck that separated the deep water from the solid ground. Thousands of men, horses, and dogs struggled through this tidal sludge, dragging crates of provisions and sleds, screaming and cursing in a cacophony that drifted over the water like the sound of a losing army in retreat. Smith adjusted his collar against the biting wind, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the beachhead. He saw no order, no police patrols, and no customs houses. He saw only a feral, unregulated bottleneck where the greed of the entire world had come to choke on its own ambition. The landing process was an exercise in brutality. Since there was no wharf capable of handling the steamer, Smith and his small retinue of associates were offloaded onto flat-bottomed scows. The boatmen, charging exorbitant rates for the short journey, rowed them toward the mudflats. When the scow ground to a halt in the slime, Smith stepped over the gunwale, his polished boots sinking instantly into the freezing mire. He did not complain. He waded ashore, flanked by Slim Jim Foster and the Reverend Bowers, his trusted lieutenants from the Denver days. They carried their luggage high on their shoulders to keep it dry, navigating a landscape littered with discarded machinery, rotting food, and the carcasses of drowned mules. The air smelled of low tide, wet wool, and the distinct metallic tang of dysentery. It was a sensory assault that would have repelled a weaker man, but Smith breathed it in deeply. It was the scent of total anarchy, and to him it smelled like absolute freedom. Once they reached the relative solidity of the beach, Smith engaged his first target. A bewildered stampeder, a man from Ohio dressed in a woolen suit completely unsuited for the climate, sat on a crate of beans, weeping. His partner had vanished with their money belt, and he was stranded at the edge of the world. Smith approached him not with a weapon but with a silver flask of brandy. He offered the man a drink and a sympathetic ear. Within 10 minutes, Smith had learned the layout of the camp, the names of the few saloon keepers who had managed to set up permanent structures, and the fact that the local deputy U.S. Marshal was a man named Taylor who was overwhelmed and underpaid. Smith slipped a $20 gold piece into the man's hand, a gesture of seeming benevolence that bought him a loyal runner for the next week. He walked on, telling Bowers that the soil here was fertile, not for crops, but for the harvest they intended to reap. The architecture of Skagway was a testament to haste. Buildings went up in hours, constructed of green lumber that dripped sap and warped in the damp air. The streets were hypothetical concepts, merely wide channels of mud that varied in depth from ankle-deep to knee-deep depending on the rain. Smith secured a location for his operations in a canvas-walled saloon known as the Pack Train. He did not ask for permission. He simply walked in, identified the owner, and offered a partnership that was more of a mandate than a proposal. He laid a stack of gold coins on the bar and introduced his muscle. The owner, looking at the hard eyes of Smith's crew and the heavy revolvers beneath their coats, accepted the new management. By that evening, Smith had a roof over his head and a base of operations located directly in the path of every miner heading for the White Pass Trail. The first few weeks were a period of aggressive expansion. Smith knew that to control the town, he had to control the flow of information. The stampeders arriving from the south were terrified and ignorant. They knew nothing of the trails, the weather, or the supplies they truly needed. Smith set up a table outside his new headquarters, placing a sign that read, "Information." When a group of greenhorns approached, he would greet them with the gravitas of a seasoned government official. He warned them of the dangers of the trail, the bandits lurking in the passes, and the necessity of hiring certified packers. These packers, of course, were members of his gang. They would take the miners' goods, transport them a few miles up the trail, and then either hold them for ransom or simply disappear with the most valuable items. The miners, returning to town to complain, would find the information table gone or manned by a different person who claimed no knowledge of the previous transaction. The violence in Skagway was unlike the organized enforcement of Denver. It was raw and impulsive. Men were shot over spaces in line, over stolen shovels, or simply because the madness of the wind drove them to it. Smith established his dominance early. On a Tuesday in September, a local tough known as Scarface Charlie attempted to muscle in on a poker game Smith was running in the back of the saloon. Charlie overturned the table, scattering gold dust and chips into the sawdust. Smith did not stand up. He remained seated, lighting a cigar, while Slim Jim Foster stepped out of the shadows. Foster did not use a gun. He used a weighted sap, striking Charlie behind the ear with a sound like a melon being dropped on stone. As the man crumpled, Smith signaled for the bartender to bring a mop. He then addressed the stunned room, apologizing for the interruption and ordering a round of drinks on the house. The message was clear. In a town of chaotic violence, Smith was the only source of organized, predictable force. Smith turned his attention to the local law enforcement. Deputy Marshal Taylor was a man drowning in a sea of crime, with no support from the federal government in Sitka. Smith paid him a visit in his tent office. He did not threaten the marshal. Instead, he offered to help maintain order. He proposed that his men would police the red light district and the gambling dens, keeping the violence down, in exchange for the marshal turning a blind eye to the commercial transactions taking place at Smith's tables. Taylor, exhausted and outgunned, accepted the arrangement. It was the Denver model transplanted to the Arctic but stripped of all pretense. The bribes were paid openly in gold dust, weighed out on the marshal's own scales. By October, the weather began to turn vicious. The rain turned to sleet and the mud in the streets froze into jagged ruts that could break a horse's leg. The flow of stampeders did not stop. It merely became more desperate. Smith capitalized on the misery. He organized a subscription drive for a church, collecting thousands of dollars from the miners who wanted to hedge their spiritual bets before heading into the wilderness. Reverend Bowers conducted services in a large tent, preaching hellfire and brimstone while his eyes scanned the congregation for heavy purses. After the service, the collection plate would be passed, and the proceeds would go directly into the operating fund of the Smith gang. It was a cynicism so profound it was almost artistic. The true horror of the gold rush was found on the trails leading out of town. The White Pass Trail was becoming known as the Dead Horse Trail. Inexperienced stampeders anxious to beat the winter drove their pack animals beyond the point of endurance. Horses were overloaded, beaten, and forced to march through mud that was belly deep. When they collapsed, they were left to die or shot where they lay. Smith rode out to inspect the trail one afternoon. He saw the carcasses of thousands of horses rotting in the canyons, their bodies forming a grim staircase for the men climbing behind them. The stench was overpowering, a miasma of decay that hung over the valley. Smith looked at the carnage and saw a business opportunity. He set up a toll gate on a particularly narrow section of the trail, claiming he had improved the grade. Men, desperate to pass the blockage of dead animals, paid the toll without question, handing over gold for the privilege of walking over corpses. As the population of Skagway swelled to over 10,000, the inevitable pushback from the respectable element began. A group of merchants and transport agents formed a committee demanding that the deputy marshal take action against the confidence men swarming the docks. They threatened to send a petition to Washington. Smith heard of the meeting and decided to attend. He walked into the hall flanked by 6 of his largest men. He did not shout. He took the podium and delivered a speech on civic virtue. He reminded the merchants that the gamblers and the saloon keepers were the ones spending money in their stores. He pointed out that the sporting men were the economic engine of the town. He warned them that driving out the sporting class would turn Skagway into a ghost town. His men stood at the back of the room, their hands resting on their holsters, silently reinforcing every point. The committee voted to table the motion. Smith's confidence grew with every victory. He began to envision Skagway not just as a hunting ground, but as a sovereign state. He recruited more men from the South, sending word to the underworlds of Seattle and San Francisco that the picking was rich. He established a hierarchy, appointing captains to run different sectors of the town. There was a captain of the wharves, a captain of the saloons, and a captain of the trail. He insisted on a code of conduct. His men were not to rob women or children, and they were to dress well. He wanted to elevate the grift, to give it a veneer of respectability. He began to wear a diamond pin on his lapel again, a symbol that civilization had arrived in the form of Soapy Smith. In late October, a significant challenge arose in the form of a vigilante group calling themselves the 101. They were serious men, armed and tired of the theft. They posted notices around town giving the undesirables 24 hours to leave. Smith read one of the notices nailed to the door of his saloon. He tore it down, crumpled it, and threw it into the mud. He ordered his men to print their own handbills. These declared that the Law and Order Committee of Skagway, Smith's own invention, would not tolerate vigilante violence. He paraded his men through the streets, 300 strong, marching in formation. They carried Winchesters and shotguns. Smith rode at the head of the column on a gray horse, waving to the crowd like a conquering general. The display of force was overwhelming. The 101 committee realized they were outgunned and retreated into the shadows, biding their time. The arrival of the first heavy snows in November changed the dynamic of the town. The passes became blocked, and the flow of men moving inland stopped. Skagway became a holding pen. Thousands of frustrated, bored, and anxious men were trapped in the town, waiting for the weather to break. This was the environment Smith had been waiting for. These men had nowhere to go and nothing to do but drink and gamble. Smith expanded his operations, opening the Jeff Smith's Parlor, a more permanent structure made of logs and fitted with electric lights powered by a noisy generator. It was the warmest, brightest place in Skagway. It was a beacon in the Arctic night. Inside the parlor, the scams were refined to an industrial efficiency. The 3-card Monte games ran 24 hours a day. The shellmen worked in shifts. Smith introduced a new diversion, the Eagle Eye. A man would be invited to look through a telescope at a distant mountain peak where a gold strike had been reported. While he was squinting through the lens, a Confederate would pick his pocket. If the man noticed the theft, he was told that he must have dropped his wallet in the excitement. If he argued, he was thrown out into the snow. The ruthlessness was absolute. A man could enter the parlor with a year's savings and leave 10 minutes later with nothing but the lint in his pockets. One evening, a young prospector from Minnesota, a boy of no more than 19, burst into the parlor accusing the dealer of cheating him out of his grub stake. The boy was crying, hysterical with the realization that he would have to return home in shame. Smith was sitting at a far table drinking champagne. He signaled for the music to stop. The room went silent. Smith walked over to the boy, put an arm around his shoulder, and spoke in a loud, fatherly voice. He told the boy that gambling was a sin and a lesson. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of gold coins, giving them to the lad. "Take this," Smith said, "and buy your passage home. The North is no place for you." The boy, stunned, took the money and fled. The crowd cheered. Smith bowed. He knew that the story of his generosity would spread, bringing 10 new suckers through the door for every dollar he had just given away. As December approached, Smith's control over Skagway was total. He controlled the deputy marshal, the flow of goods, and the entertainment. He began to insert himself into the legitimate commerce of the town. He bought into the wharf companies, ensuring that he got a cut of every crate unloaded. He invested in the local newspaper, dictating which stories ran and which were suppressed. He was becoming the landlord of the gateway to the Klondike. He sat in his office listening to the wind howl off the glaciers, planning his next move. The town was his, but he needed a way to extract the money from the men who were too smart to gamble. He needed a scam that preyed on their hearts, not just their greed. He began to formulate the idea for the telegraph office. The telegraph lines from the south had not yet reached Skagway. The nearest station was hundreds of miles away. But the miners didn't know that. They were desperate to send news home to their wives and mothers, to tell them they were alive. Smith looked at the map on his wall, tracing the imaginary line of a wire that did not exist. He smiled. It was the ultimate confidence game. He would sell them a connection to the world that was entirely a fiction. It would be his masterpiece. The darkness of the Alaskan winter settled over the camp, turning day into a gray twilight. The temperature dropped to 20 degrees below zero. The mud froze into iron-hard ridges. The tents were replaced by cabins, but the misery remained. Smith moved through the town like a wraith, wrapped in a fur coat that cost more than most men earned in a lifetime. He was the king of Skagway, the lord of the Lynn Canal. He had turned a muddy beach into a personal treasury. But as he walked past the frozen bodies of the horses on the edge of town, he felt a flicker of the old paranoia. The 101 committee was quiet, but they were watching. The eyes of the town were shifting. He knew that winter was his ally, trapping the victims. But he also knew that the spring thaw would bring new dangers. On Christmas Eve, 1897, Smith hosted a banquet for the poor and destitute of Skagway. He set up long tables in the street, serving roast turkey and hot coffee. He stood at the head of the table, offering a toast to the Queen of England and the President of the United States. He looked out at the faces of the men he had robbed, men who were now eating his food and thanking him for his kindness. It was the pinnacle of his career. He had stolen their gold and bought their loyalty with a turkey leg. He raised his glass to the snowy peaks, the silent sentinels of his empire. "To Skagway," he whispered, the steam of his breath vanishing into the cold night. "The only town on earth where a man can be a devil and a saint in the same hour." The year ended with Smith firmly entrenched. The invasion was complete. The occupation had begun. He had survived the landing, the mud, and the initial resistance. Now he had to survive the success. The gold rush was far from over, and the biggest scores were yet to come. But in the silence of his room later that night, Smith cleaned his revolver, checking the action with a methodical precision. He knew that in a town built on greed, the only thing that kept a man on top was the willingness to be more ruthless than anyone else. And Jefferson Randolph Smith was prepared to be very, very ruthless. January 15th, 1898. The silence of the Alaskan winter was a physical weight that pressed down on the chaotic sprawl of Skagway. The deep snows had choked off the mountain passes, sealing the town into a frozen isolation that felt absolute. For the thousands of men trapped in the valley, the only connection to the outside world was the erratic arrival of steamers from the south, which were often delayed by weeks due to the violent storms of the Lynn Canal. Communication was non-existent. Letters took a month to travel to Seattle, and replies took just as long if they arrived at all. In this vacuum of information, homesickness became a pathology. Men sat in their drafty cabins staring at tintype photographs of wives and children they had not seen in months, desperate for a single word of reassurance. Jefferson Randolph Smith, sitting in the warmth of his office at the parlor, recognized this longing not as a human tragedy but as a market inefficiency waiting to be exploited. He understood that a man would pay a premium for whiskey to warm his belly, but he would pay a fortune for a voice from home to warm his heart. The solution he devised was an engineering marvel of pure deceit. Smith ordered his carpenters to construct a small, officious-looking building near the center of town. He had a sign painted in bold, authoritative letters: Skagway and Yukon Telegraph Company. To the casual observer, it appeared that civilization had finally bridged the gap to the north. Workmen spent days stringing heavy gauge wire from the roof of the office, running it out toward the tree line and up into the snowy foothills. To the uncritical eye, the wires seemed to head south toward Juneau and the submarine cables that connected to the continental United States. In reality, the wires ran for a few hundred yards into the dense scrub brush and terminated abruptly, buried under a pile of snow or wrapped around a dead stump. It was a bridge to nowhere, a technological facade built to harvest the misery of the stranded. The interior of the office was theater of the highest caliber. Smith installed a service counter with a wire grill, behind which sat a telegraph operator wearing a green visor and sleeve garters. The room was filled with the rhythmic staccato clicking of a telegraph key. The operator, a skilled shill from the Denver gang, tapped out nonsense messages hour after hour to create the sonic atmosphere of a busy communication hub. On the wall hung a map with a red line drawn from Skagway to Seattle, a visual lie that comforted the customers. The price for a message was $5, a significant sum, but the line of men waiting outside the door stretched down the boardwalk. They stood in the freezing wind, clutching scraps of paper on which they had written their messages of love, regret, and hope. The scam operated on a delayed fuse. A miner would step up to the counter, hand over his $5 and his message. The operator would count the words, take the gold dust or coins, and then, with great concentration, tap the message out on the key. The miner would watch the operator's hand, believing that each click was sending his voice across the frozen wastes to his family in Ohio or New York. The operator would then nod and tell the man that a reply usually took 3 to 4 hours. The miner would leave, his step lighter, his heart filled with anticipation. He would wander the town, perhaps spending money in Smith's saloons while he waited, buoyed by the belief that he was no longer alone. When the miner returned hours later, the second phase of the trap was sprung. The operator would smile and hand him a sealed envelope. Inside was a reply from his wife or mother. The message was generic but plausible. Phrases like, "All is well, we miss you," or "Send money when you can." The miner, blinded by emotion, rarely questioned how the reply could have arrived so quickly or why the phrasing was so vague. But often Smith added a twist to extract more capital. The operator would hand over the telegram and say, "There is a collect charge on the reply, sir. $10. The miner, terrified that the message contained an emergency or desperate to read the words of his beloved, would pay the extortionate fee without hesitation. Smith was selling ink and paper for the price of gold, and the customers thanked him for it. The telegraph office was a cash machine, generating hundreds of dollars a day with zero overhead beyond the rent and the salary of the fake operator. Occasionally, a man with technical knowledge would ask questions about the route of the line or the voltage. Smith had a protocol for this. A large, menacing man named Big Ed Burns would step out from the back room posing as the line foreman. He would aggressively explain that the line was a proprietary system using new induction technology and that curiosity was interfering with official business. If the skeptic persisted, he was physically removed from the premises. The illusion was protected by force. As the winter of 1898 began to thaw into the muddy slush of spring, the telegraph scam continued to run, but Smith's ambitions grew larger. The news that reached Skagway in April shifted the psychological landscape of the town entirely. The United States battleship Maine had exploded in Havana Harbor. and the nation was hurtling toward war with Spain. Patriotism swept through the gold camps like a fever. Men who had been focused solely on personal enrichment suddenly felt the pull of national duty. Smith, ever the opportunist, saw a way to convert this jingoistic energy into personal power. He would not just be the boss of the underworld, he would be the defender of the territory. Smith announced the formation of the Skagway Military Company, a volunteer militia dedicated to protecting the Alaskan coast from the threat of Spanish invasion. The idea was ludicrous from a strategic standpoint. The Spanish fleet was thousands of miles away in the Caribbean or the Philippines and had no interest in a mud-choked port in the Arctic. But the logic did not matter. The emotion mattered. Smith appointed himself captain of the company. He utilized his own funds to purchase uniforms, rifles, and ammunition. He recruited the hardest men in his gang, along with legitimate citizens who were swept up in the war fever to fill the ranks. The drills were held on Broadway, the main street of Skagway. Smith, dressed in a tailored uniform with gold braid and a sword at his hip, marched his private army through the mud. He shouted commands with the authority of a West Point graduate. The citizens lined the boardwalks to cheer. The same men who robbed them at night were now marching to defend them by day. It was a masterstroke of public relations. By wrapping his criminal organization in the flag, Smith made it socially unacceptable to criticize him. To speak against Soapy Smith was to speak against the defense of America. He petitioned the War Department in Washington for official recognition and induction into the U.S. Army. While the bureaucrats in D.C. eventually rejected the offer, seeing it for the absurdity it was, the rejection letter did not arrive for weeks. In the interim, Smith was the supreme military commander of Skagway. This new legitimacy allowed Smith to tighten his grip on the town's administration. The deputy U.S. Marshal Taylor was now completely subservient to Smith. The militia effectively became the police force. If a merchant refused to pay protection money, he wasn't visited by a thug. He was visited by a squad of soldiers conducting a security inspection. Smith used the militia to intimidate the 101 Committee, the vigilante group that had threatened him the previous autumn. He marched his company past their meeting places, the rhythmic thud of boots on wood serving as a not-so-subtle reminder of who held the monopoly on violence. In May of 1898, the governor of the District of Alaska, John Brady, visited Skagway. Governor Brady was a well-meaning but naive administrator who saw Smith not as a gangster, but as a stabilizing force in a chaotic region. Smith met the governor at the wharf, surrounded by his honor guard. He escorted Brady through the town, pointing out the improvements he had made, the order he maintained, and the patriotic spirit of his militia. He hosted a banquet in the governor's honor at the parlor. Smith sat at the head of the table, pouring champagne for the highest official in the territory. They toasted to the president, to the victory over Spain, and to the future of Alaska. Brady, impressed by Smith's charisma and the apparent discipline of his men, publicly offered Smith a commission as a captain in the Territorial Guard, unofficially acknowledging his rank. It was the apex of Smith's con. He had swindled the governor himself, not out of money, but out of recognition. However, beneath the surface of parades and banquets, the tension in Skagway was reaching a breaking point. The spring thaw had opened the passes and the turnbacks began to arrive. These were men who had failed to reach the gold fields, men who had been broken by the Chilkoot Trail, or who had run out of supplies. They drifted back into Skagway destitute, angry, and with nothing left to lose. They were not fresh greenhorns easily cowed by a fake telegraph. They were hardened survivors who realized they had been fleeced. The stories of the telegraph scam, the rigged poker games, and the toll booths began to circulate with more venom. The 101 Committee began to recruit these angry men. They met in secret, whispering that the captain was nothing more than a thief in a costume. Smith sensed the rising tide of resentment. He increased the visibility of his power. He walked the streets with a bodyguard of 3 men at all times. He began to drink more, heavily, his temper becoming brittle. One afternoon in June, a newspaper editor named J.M. Tanner wrote an editorial questioning the legitimacy of the Skagway Military Company. Smith went to the newspaper office, not with a lawyer, but with a hickory club. He smashed the printing press and told Tanner that the next time he printed sedition, he would be shot as a Spanish spy. The violence was no longer hidden behind a smile. It was overt and political. Smith was functioning as a dictator, using the language of war to suppress dissent. The climax of Smith's theatrical rule came on July 4, 1898. The Independence Day celebration in Skagway was planned to be the largest event in the history of the territory. Smith was appointed the Marshal of the Day. It was a title that carried no legal weight but immense symbolic power. He was the master of ceremonies for the birth of the nation. The morning broke with a clear blue sky, a rarity in the coastal range. The town was draped in bunting and flags. The mud had dried into a hard crust, allowing the procession to move freely. Smith rode a magnificent gray horse, an animal he had imported specifically for this purpose. He wore a sash of red, white, and blue across his chest. His uniform was immaculate, his boots polished to a mirror shine. He led the parade down Broadway, sitting tall in the saddle, tipping his hat to the cheering crowds. Behind him marched his militia, their rifles shouldered, moving in perfect lockstep. Then came the governor, the town council, and the fire brigade. The irony was so thick it could be tasted in the dust. The man who had organized the systematic robbery of every person lining the street was now leading them in a celebration of liberty. As Smith rode past the reviewing stand, he looked out at the sea of faces. He saw the admiration in the eyes of the newcomers who didn't know better. He saw the fear in the eyes of the merchants who paid him tribute. And he saw the cold, hard hatred in the eyes of the men standing at the back of the crowd, the men of the 101 committee who were silent and unmoving. Smith smiled, a tight, arrogant smile. He believed he had won. He believed that the uniform and the governor's blessing had made him untouchable. He rode his horse up to the dais and dismounted, taking his place beside Governor Brady. He delivered a speech about patriotism, duty, and the destiny of the North. His voice carried over the crowd, strong and confident. "We are the vanguard of civilization," Smith shouted, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "We have tamed this wilderness not with the pick and the shovel, but with the spirit of American enterprise." The crowd roared its approval, unaware that the enterprise Smith spoke of was the enterprise of the predator. He was the wolf telling the sheep how proud he was of the flock. After the parade, the town erupted into a debauchery that lasted well into the white nights of the Arctic summer. The saloons were packed, the gambling tables were overflowing, and fireworks exploded over the Lynn Canal. Smith held court at Jeff Smith's parlor, buying drinks for the house. He sat on a velvet throne he had installed in the corner, accepting the congratulations of his subjects. He felt invincible. He had the governor in his pocket, an army at his back, and the town under his boot. He told his brother Bascom that they were untouchable, that they would run Skagway for another 10 years. But even as the champagne flowed, the machinery of his destruction was grinding into gear. The 4th of July celebration was a facade. The returning miners, the robbed stampeders, and the frustrated business owners had reached their limit. The parade had been the final insult. Seeing the criminal boss parading as a war hero had crystallized their resolve. They realized that the law would never come to Skagway. They would have to become the law. In the shadows of the warehouses and the back rooms of the rival saloons, the Vigilance Committee was finalizing their list of names. At the top of that list, underlined in heavy ink, was Jefferson Randolph Smith. The night of July 4th ended with Smith stumbling back to his private cabin, drunk on power and wine. He fell asleep with his uniform still on, the sash tangled around his legs. He did not hear the whispers in the street. He did not see the grim faces of the men watching his cabin from the alleyway. He dreamed of a telegraph line that actually connected to the world, a line that carried the news of his greatness to the president himself. He did not know that the wire had already been cut, and the message coming down the line was not one of glory, but of a reckoning that would arrive with the speed of a bullet. The King of Skagway had celebrated his last holiday. The summer sun that never fully set was illuminating a town that was ready to wake up from the nightmare he had constructed. July 7th, 1898. 3 days after the patriotic pageantry of the Independence Day parade, Skagway sat under a heavy gray sky that threatened rain but delivered only a clinging mist. The bunting that had adorned the storefronts on Broadway was sagging, damp and limp, a visual hangover from the celebration. The town had returned to its grinding rhythm of commerce and transit, but the atmosphere had shifted. The tolerance that the local merchants had extended to the criminal element was fraying like an old rope under too much tension. Into this volatile environment walked John Douglas Stewart, a man who unknowingly carried the spark that would ignite the entire powder keg. Stewart was not a greenhorn fresh off the steamer. He was a stampeder returning from the interior. He had survived the brutal winter of the Yukon. He had worked a claim on the creeks near Dawson City. And he was coming home, a victor. He carried his victory in a heavy poke of moose hide, a sack containing roughly $3,000 in gold dust, the physical manifestation of a year of freezing hell and backbreaking labor. Stewart moved through the mud of Skagway with the wary gait of a man who knows he is a target. He was heading for the wharf to book passage on the next steamer south to Seattle. He wanted nothing more than to leave the lawless territory behind him and return to civilization with his fortune intact. However, the ecosystem of Skagway was designed specifically to intercept men like him before they could reach the water. Jefferson Randolph Smith's network of steerers and spies was not just watching the incoming ships, they were patrolling the trails leading into town. They spotted Stewart almost immediately. He looked the part, weather-beaten face, worn clothes, and the distinct protective way he guarded the heavy sack at his side. The word went out to the parlor. A bird with heavy feathers was walking down Broadway. The approach was made by two of Smith's most reliable men, the Reverend Bowers and a thug named Tripp. They did not mug him in the street. That was too crude for the Smith organization. They used the oldest lure in the book, friendship. They fell into step beside Stewart, admiring his pack, asking about the conditions on the Klondike, and congratulating him on his success. They acted as fellow travelers, men who were also looking to ship out. They suggested that Stewart must be thirsty after the long hike down from the pass. They pointed toward Jeff Smith's parlor, describing it not as a gambling hell but as the finest establishment in town, a place where a man could get a clean drink and relax before dealing with the chaos of the ticket agents. Stewart, tired and letting his guard down in the company of these seemingly amiable countrymen, agreed to a single drink. Once inside the parlor, the trap constricted. The front room was loud and crowded, but Bowers and Tripp guided Stewart to a smaller, quieter room, in the back, ostensibly to escape the noise. This room was the slaughterhouse. It was sparsely furnished with a table and a few chairs. Smith was not in the room, but his presence was felt in the efficiency of the operation. The men engaged Stewart in conversation about the gold. They asked to see it, to weigh it, perhaps offering to give him a better exchange rate than the banks. Stewart, perhaps clouded by the first drink or simply outnumbered, placed his sack on the table. In a blur of motion, the sack was snatched. It was not a sleight-of-hand switch this time. It was a grab. The men claimed that Stewart had lost the gold in a bet, or they simply took it and dared him to do something about it. The pretense of the game had been abandoned for naked theft. Stewart did not accept his loss with the resignation of the greenhorns who had been fleeced by the soap game or the telegraph scam. He was a man who had dug that gold out of the frozen earth with his own hands. He roared in anger, overturning the chair. He demanded his dust back. The gang members laughed at him, their hands hovering near the pistols under their coats. They told him to get out before he lost more than his money. Stewart, realizing that physical violence in that room would result in his death, backed out of the parlor. He stood in the street, the rain beginning to fall, shaking with rage. He had walked hundreds of miles, survived scurvy and cold, only to be robbed in broad daylight 3 blocks from the ocean. His first stop was the office of Deputy U.S. Marshal Taylor. Stewart slammed his fist on the marshal's desk, recounting the theft and demanding that Taylor arrest Smith's men and retrieve the sack. Taylor, who was receiving a substantial cut of the parlor's profits, leaned back in his chair and picked his teeth. He looked at Stewart with a bored expression. He told the miner that gambling debts were a civil matter. He suggested that if Stewart had lost his money at cards, he had no one to blame but himself. He insinuated that Stewart was drunk and misremembering the events. Taylor refused to issue a warrant. He refused to even walk down the street to investigate. He told Stewart to move along and stop disturbing the peace. This betrayal by the law was the catalyst for what followed. Stewart did not go back to his tent to weep. He went to the merchants. He walked into the offices of the transport companies, the dry goods stores, and the legitimate saloons. He told his story to anyone who would listen. He explained that he had been robbed of $3,000 and that the marshal wouldn't lift a finger. The reaction among the business community was immediate and electric. For months, the merchants had tolerated Smith because he brought money into the town and kept a lid on the random violence. But the robbery of a returning miner was different. It struck at the very heart of Skagway's economy. The logic of the merchants was cold and economic. Skagway existed for one reason. It was the gateway to the Klondike. If the word spread that returning miners, men who had successfully struck it rich, were being stripped of their fortunes in Skagway, the stampeders would stop coming. They would divert their traffic to the rival town of Dia, or use the all-water route to St. Michael. If the trail of gold dried up, Skagway would collapse. The robbery of J.D. Stewart was not just a crime against one man. It was an act of economic sabotage against the entire town. The merchants realized that Soapy Smith was no longer a colorful local character or a necessary evil. He was a cancer that was about to kill the host. On the evening of July 7th, a secret meeting was called. It was not the disorganized gathering of the previous year. This was the Committee of 101, a vigilance organization that had been dormant but never disbanded. They met in the back of a warehouse, the rain drumming on the tin roof. The mood was grim. Men who had previously been neutral, men who had marched in Smith's parade just 3 days earlier, were now calling for a rope. They listened to Stewart's testimony. They verified the facts. They decided that the time for petitions and letters to Washington was over. They needed to take direct action. The committee drafted a demand. It was simple. Jefferson Randolph Smith must return the $3,000 in gold to John Douglas Stewart by the following morning, or face the consequences. They did not specify what the consequences were, but the implication of violence hung heavy in the damp air. A delegation of 3 men was chosen to deliver the message to Smith. They were not armed, but they carried the weight of the entire business district behind them. They walked through the mud to Jeff Smith's parlor, pushing through the swinging doors into the smoke-filled room. Smith received the delegation in his office. He was drinking champagne, his feet propped up on his desk, when the men delivered the ultimatum. Smith did not look concerned. He looked amused. He laughed in their faces. He told them that Stewart was a sore loser who had bet his poke on a sure thing and lost. He claimed that he ran a legitimate business and that he would not be dictated to by a group of shopkeepers. He stood up, his voice rising with the arrogance of a man who believed he owned the ground he stood on. He reminded them that he was the captain of the Skagay Military Company. He had 300 armed men at his command. He asked the delegation if they were prepared to start a war in the streets. He told them to go back to their shops and sell their flour and beans and leave the governing of the town to men with iron in their blood. The delegation left the parlor empty-handed, but the rejection hardened their resolve. When they reported back to the committee, the anger in the warehouse shifted into a cold, tactical determination. The merchants realized that Smith would never yield to words. They sent out runners to every respectable household and business in Skagway. They called for a mass meeting to be held the next evening at the Sylvester Hall. They advised all men to come armed. The silence of the night was broken by the sound of rifles being cleaned and shotguns being loaded. The veneer of civilization that Smith had mocked was being stripped away, revealing the raw frontier justice beneath. Throughout the day of July 8th, the tension in Skagway was palpable. The streets were strangely quiet. The gambling halls were empty as men stayed indoors, sensing the coming storm. Smith, sensing the shift, tried to rally his own forces. He gathered his gang at the parlor. He distributed whiskey and ammunition. He told them that the stranglers, his term for the vigilantes, were coming to hang them all. He tried to frame the conflict as a battle between the working man and the elite oligarchy of the merchants. He paced the floor of the saloon, his face flushed, his eyes darting to the windows. He was still confident, but it was the manic confidence of a gambler who has pushed all his chips into the center of the table on a bluff. Smith made a critical error in judgment. He believed that his militia, the men he had marched down Broadway, would stand and fight for him. He did not realize that many of the volunteers in his company were legitimate citizens who had joined for patriotic reasons, not to protect a thief. As the news of the Stewart robbery spread, members of the militia began to quietly resign. They took off their uniforms and joined the growing crowd at Sylvester Hall. Smith's army was melting away like snow in July, leaving him with only the hardcore nucleus of his criminal gang. Perhaps 20 or 30 men against a town of thousands. The meeting at Sylvester Hall began in the early evening. The hall was packed to capacity. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, their wet coats steaming in the heat of the room. J.D. Stewart stood on the stage, holding his empty hands up to the crowd, a living testament to the town's shame. The speakers did not call for a lynching. They called for expulsion. They proposed that Smith and his top lieutenants be rounded up and placed on the next boat out of Alaska, never to return. But as the debate raged, it became clear that the hall was too small. The crowd was spilling out into the street. They needed a larger venue. Someone shouted that they should move to the Juneau Company Wharf, located at the end of a long pier jutting out into the bay. It was a strategic choice. The wharf could be easily guarded, preventing Smith's spies from infiltrating the meeting. Smith heard about the relocation of the meeting. He sat in the parlor listening to the reports from his runners. He was told that hundreds, perhaps over 1,000 men were marching toward the wharf. He was told that they were armed. His advisors, men like Bowers and Foster, urged him to barricade the parlor and wait it out. They told him that going to the wharf would be suicide. But Smith was not a man who hid in a hole. His ego, fed by years of dominance in Denver, Creede, and Skagway, could not accept the idea that the town was rejecting him. He believed that he could talk them down. He believed that his personal charisma was powerful enough to disperse the mob. He stood up and grabbed his hat. He put on his heavy coat. He took a Winchester Model 1892 rifle from the rack behind the bar. He checked the magazine. It was fully loaded. He slung the rifle over his shoulder, barrel pointing up. He grabbed a second weapon, a Colt revolver, and shoved it into his pocket. He turned to his men. "I'm going down there," he announced. "I'm going to put a stop to this nonsense." His voice was slurred slightly by the alcohol he had consumed throughout the day, but his movement was steady. He walked out of the parlor alone. The walk to the wharf was a lonely procession. The boardwalks were deserted. The windows of the shops were dark. The only sound was the crunch of Smith's boots on the gravel and the distant murmur of the crowd at the pier. He walked past the telegraph office, the scene of his cleverest scam. He walked past the church he had helped build. He walked past the office of the marshal who was in his pocket. He was walking through a museum of his own corruption. He did not look left or right. His eyes were fixed on the end of the street where the wooden planks of the wharf extended out over the gray water. As he approached the entrance to the wharf, he could see the mass of men gathered at the far end. They were a dark shape against the twilight sky. Guarding the entrance to the pier were 4 men chosen by the committee to act as sentries. Among them was Frank Reed, a surveyor and city engineer, a man known for his quiet demeanor and steady nerves. Reed stood in the center of the path, holding a revolver. He watched Smith approach. He did not shout. He simply stood his ground, a barrier between the chaos of the outlaw and the order of the vigilantes. Smith saw Reed. He knew him. They had spoken before in the streets of Skagway. Smith did not stop. He kept walking, his hand moving to the rifle on his shoulder. He shouted at Reed, "Get out of the way, Frank!" It was not a request. It was a command from a man who had never been disobeyed. Reed did not move. He raised his hand, palm out, a universal signal to halt. The distance between them closed. 50 yards, 40 yards, 30 yards. The air was thick with the smell of the sea and the impending violence. The robbery of J.D. Stewart had started as a simple theft, a grabbing of a sack of gold in a back room. But in the span of 24 hours, it had transformed into a referendum on the soul of Skagway. The gold was no longer the issue. The issue was whether a town built on the edge of the wilderness could ever truly be civilized, or if it was destined to be ruled by the strongest predator. Smith believed he was the solution. The men on the wharf believed he was the problem. And as Jefferson Randolph Smith took the final steps toward the guard post, the time for debate had ended. The wind picked up, blowing off the Lynn Canal, whipping Smith's coat around his legs. He was alone, a solitary figure marching against a tide of history that had finally turned against him. He was the king of the con, the colonel of the City Hall War, the dictator of Creed. But in the fading light of July 8th, he was just a man with a rifle walking toward a man with a gun, and the gold of J.D. Stewart was the heavy stone that was dragging him down into the deep. July 8th, 1898. The Arctic twilight hung over the Lynn Canal like a bruise, a mix of purple and gray that refused to fade into true darkness. It was 9 o'clock in the evening, yet the sun still skirted the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the rough-hewn planks of the Juneau Company wharf. The air was heavy with the smell of creosote, salt water, and the damp wool of the men standing guard at the entrance to the pier. 4 sentries stood in a loose line blocking the path that stretched out over the tidal flats to the warehouse where the mass meeting was taking place. Among them was Frank Reed, the city surveyor. He was a man of 54 years, small in stature but possessed of a quiet, granite-like solidity. He was not a hired gun or a brawler. He was a man of mathematics and measurements, a civil engineer who believed in lines, boundaries, and structural integrity. Tonight he had drawn a line across the entrance to the wharf, and he intended to hold it against the chaos that governed the town. Jefferson Randolph Smith walked down the center of State Street. his gait surprisingly steady for the amount of alcohol he had consumed since the Stewart robbery. He carried the Winchester rifle slung over his right shoulder, the muzzle pointing toward the pale sky. In his pocket, the weighted Colt revolver bumped against his hip with every step. He was alone. The entourage that usually surrounded him, the sycophants, the bodyguards, the shills, had evaporated. They were hiding in the back rooms of the parlor or packing their bags in panicked silence. Smith moved with the momentum of a man who had never been denied entry to a room in his life. He saw the guards ahead. He recognized Reed. He did not slow down. In his mind, this was simply another negotiation, another moment where his voice and his presence would bend reality to his will. He believed that the sheer force of his personality was a shield that no bullet could pierce. As Smith stepped onto the approach of the wharf, the hollow thud of his boots on the timber announced his arrival. The crowd gathered at the far end of the pier hundreds of yards away fell silent. The attention of the entire town focused on the narrow strip of wood where two men were converging. Frank Reed stepped forward, separating himself from the other guards, a man named Jesse Murphy and two others who hung back slightly. Reed raised his hand, palm outward. He called out in a voice that was calm but carried clearly over the sound of the lapping water. He told Smith to halt. He stated that no one was allowed down the wharf. Smith continued to walk. He was now within striking distance. His face was flushed, his eyes bright with a dangerous, manic energy. He shouted back at Reed, demanding to know who was stopping him. He cursed the guard, calling him an old woman and ordering him to stand aside. He did not stop. He kept moving until he was face to face with the surveyor. The physical proximity was suffocating. Smith swung the Winchester off his shoulder, gripping the lever action. He did not raise it to fire immediately. Instead, he used the barrel as a club, swinging it viciously at Reed's head. He screamed at Reed to get out of the way or he would smash his skull. Reed reacted with the reflexes of a man fighting for his life. He threw up his left arm, deflecting the rifle barrel just enough so that it struck his shoulder rather than his temple. At the same time, his right hand went for the revolver in his pocket. The interaction descended into a clumsy, desperate grapple. Smith, enraged by the resistance, jerked the rifle back and tried to bring the muzzle to bear on Reed. Reed lunged forward, grabbing the barrel of the Winchester with his left hand, forcing it down. The two men locked together, dancing a grim waltz on the slippery planks. Smith shouted, "My God, don't shoot!" But the plea was mixed with the click of the rifle hammer being cocked. The silence of the evening was shattered by the deafening roar of gunfire. It is a matter of debate who fired first, but the shots came so close together they sounded like a single ragged explosion. Smith pulled the trigger of the Winchester. The rifle, angled downward by Reed's grip, discharged a .44 caliber slug directly into Reed's groin. The heavy projectile shattered the bone and tore through the femoral artery, exiting the surveyor's body and lodging in the planking of the wharf. The impact was catastrophic, but Reed did not fall immediately. Adrenaline and shock held him upright for a fraction of a second, long enough for him to pull the trigger of his own revolver. Reed's pistol roared. The bullet struck Smith in the left side of the chest, piercing the heart and severing the aorta. It was a fatal wound, a mortal injury that destroyed the engine of Smith's life in an instant. Smith staggered back, the rifle slipping from his fingers and clattering onto the wood. He clutched at his chest, his eyes going wide with a sudden, terrible clarity. He tried to speak, but his mouth filled with blood. He collapsed onto the wharf, falling hard on his back. His legs twitched once, a final neurological spasm, and then he was still. The king of Skagway, the man who had ruled the gold rush with a smile and a bludgeon, lay dead in the dirt of the dock, staring up at the empty Alaskan sky. Frank Reed crumpled a moment later, his legs giving way as the blood pumped out of his severed artery. He fell beside Smith, groaning in agony. The other guards, Murphy, Captain Josias Martin Tanner, and John Landers, rushed forward. Murphy snatched Smith's own rifle from the deck and in the heat of the moment fired another round into Smith's prone body, a bullet that was entirely unnecessary. The echo of the shots rolled across the bay and bounced off the canyon walls, a signal that the reign of terror was over. The crowd at the end of the wharf surged forward, a tidal wave of shouting men running toward the sound of the guns. The scene on the wharf became a tableau of chaos. Men stood over Smith's body, staring down at the man they had feared for a year. He looked small in death. The expensive fur coat was muddy, the diamond pin on his lapel catching the last light of the sun. Someone reached down and checked his pockets, pulling out the Colt revolver he had never drawn. The myth of invincibility had been punctured by a piece of metal weighing less than an ounce. The fear that had paralyzed the town evaporated, replaced instantly by a feral desire for vengeance against the remnants of the gang. While Smith lay cooling on the planks, Frank Reed was lifted gently by a dozen hands. They improvised a stretcher from a door torn off a nearby shed. He was pale, his face beaded with the sweat of shock. They carried him quickly toward the hospital, the men running in step to minimize the jarring. Reed was conscious, gritting his teeth against the pain that radiated from his shattered pelvis. He asked if Smith was dead. When they told him yes, he nodded slowly and closed his eyes. He had done his job. He had held the line. The death of Soapy Smith acted as a signal for the purge of Skagway. The vigilantes, now numbering in the hundreds and armed with every weapon available, fanned out through the town. They did not wait for warrants. They kicked in the doors of the saloons and the brothels. They stormed Jeff Smith's parlor, overturning the tables and smashing the roulette wheels. The gang members, realizing their protector was gone, tried to flee. They ran for the woods, they tried to hide in the bilges of the steamers, and they scrambled under the floorboards of the cabins. It was a hunt. Slim Jim Foster was found hiding in a packing crate behind a warehouse. He was dragged out by his collar, weeping and begging for mercy. The vigilantes tied his hands behind his back and marched him to a holding pen they had established in the loft of a store. The Reverend Bowers was caught trying to board a boat disguised as a woman, wearing a heavy shawl and a bonnet. The disguise failed when a vigilante noticed his boots. He was stripped of the bonnet and thrown in with Foster. One by one, the men who had terrorized the trail were rounded up. Tripp, the man who had helped rob Stewart, was found cowering in a ravine outside of town. He was brought back at gunpoint, his face scratched by briars and his arrogance gone. By the morning of July 9th, the town was under the absolute control of the Committee of 101. The jail was overflowing. The streets were patrolled by armed citizens wearing white armbands. The atmosphere was one of grim satisfaction. The threat of a lynching hung heavy in the air. Ropes were tossed over the beams of the warehouses, swinging ominously in the wind. The leaders of the committee, however, argued for law. They did not want to replace Smith's lawlessness with their own. They decided that the gang members would be held until they could be shipped out to Sitka for trial, or simply deported from the territory forever. Jefferson Randolph Smith's body was moved to the morgue, a cold room in the back of the undertaker's shop. He lay on a slab, stripped of his finery. The coroner performed a cursory examination, noting the bullet wounds and the smell of alcohol that still lingered on the corpse. There was no weeping widow, no grieving family to claim him. His brother Bascom was in jail, caught in the dragnet. Smith was alone in death as he had been in his ambition. The town he had built, the businesses he had taxed, the people he had ruled, they all turned their backs on him. On July 11th, the funeral for Soapy Smith was held. It was a stark affair. He was not buried in the main cemetery with the respectable citizens. He was interred just outside the consecrated ground, a final boundary he could not cross. The minister spoke briefly, muttering a few words about judgment and mercy that felt hollow in the cold wind. A few curious onlookers stood by, not to mourn, but to verify that he was truly in the ground. As the dirt hit the pine coffin, it marked the end of the last true frontier boss. The West had been wild, and Smith had been its final glorious parasite, but the host had finally developed an immunity. Frank Reed lingered for 12 days. The doctors did what they could, but the damage to his internal organs and the infection that followed were too severe for the medicine of the time. He lay in the hospital bed, fading in and out of consciousness. The town treated him as a martyr. Women brought flowers to his room. Men stood vigil in the hallway. When he finally died on July 20th, the entire town went into mourning. His funeral was the largest in the history of Skagway. Businesses closed, flags were lowered to half-staff, and a massive procession followed his casket to the cemetery. A large stone monument was erected over his grave, inscribed with the words, "He gave his life for the honor of Skagway." With Smith dead and the gang dismantled, the nature of Skagway changed overnight. The telegraph office with the dead wires was torn down. The shell games disappeared from the street corners. The soap racket became a memory, a story told to frighten newcomers. The town settled into a semblance of order. The gold rush continued, but the predatory edge was duller. The stampeders could walk from the wharf to the hotel without fear of being steered into a trap. The dictator was gone, replaced by the mundane machinery of municipal government. The legacy of Soapy Smith, however, proved harder to bury than the man himself. In the years that followed, the story of his reign grew. He became a figure of folklore, a symbol of the era when the individual could carve a kingdom out of the mud with nothing but his wits and a lack of conscience. The tourists who began to arrive in the decades later did not want to see the grave of the surveyor. They wanted to see the grave of the outlaw. They wanted to see the parlor, to hear the stories of the skull and crossbones, and to buy a bar of prize soap as a souvenir. Smith, in a final act of irony, became the town's most valuable commodity in death, just as he had tried to make it his bank in life. The saga of the con man who turned a boomtown into his personal bank ended not with a grand heist or a getaway to Mexico, but with a clumsy scuffle on a wet dock. It was a gritty, unromantic conclusion to a life lived in the headlines. There were no last words of wisdom, no dramatic speeches. There was just the sharp crack of a revolver, the smell of burnt powder, and the cold reality of a body hitting the floor. The frontier closed that night on the Juneau Wharf. The era of the open town, the wide-open gambling, and the rule of the gun was finished. Civilization had arrived, and it had arrived with a bullet. As the weeks turned into months, the snow began to fall again on the passes. The White Pass Trail was covered in white, hiding the bones of the horses and the debris of the rush. The grave of Jefferson Smith was covered as well, a small mound in the vastness of the Alaskan wilderness. But down in the town, in the saloons that still operated, men still raised a glass to the memory of the man. They didn't toast his goodness, for he had none. They toasted his audacity. They toasted the sheer, undeniable fact that for one brief, violent winter, a con man from Georgia had held the world at ransom. And for a little while the world had paid up.